The Second Coming of Napoleon. What if France had won at Waterloo? Written by Marcus Drayson, narrated by Gloria Feathers. Chapter 1. The Fateful Battle. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, is widely regarded as one of history's most decisive conflicts. It marked the end of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign and the beginning of a new European order. However, had the battle played out differently, had Napoleon emerged victorious, France and the world would have been set on an entirely new course. A French victory at Waterloo was not an impossibility. Napoleon, despite being outnumbered, was still a military genius who had orchestrated countless triumphs before. His strategy depended on dividing and defeating the Anglo-Allied and Prussian forces separately before they could fully unite. For much of the battle, the French had the upper hand, with their artillery hammering British lines and their cavalry sowing chaos among enemy ranks. One key turning point was the delayed arrival of Marshal Grouchy and his troops. Had Grouchy pursued and effectively neutralized the Prussian forces under Blücher, Napoleon would have been able to concentrate his full strength on Wellington's forces, likely forcing them into retreat. With the British lines collapsing and no reinforcements arriving, the battlefield could have been transformed from a site of French defeat into one of Napoleon's most remarkable victories. The implications of such a turn of events would have been monumental. Wellington's forces, overwhelmed and in disarray, would have been forced to retreat toward Brussels, potentially leading to the capture of the city. Without the crushing defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon could have returned to Paris as a triumphant leader, not as a fugitive heading toward exile. His reputation, momentarily shaken after his return from Elba, would have been fully restored. The morale of the French army and the people would have soared, solidifying his grip on power. More importantly, the diplomatic landscape of Europe would have been thrown into chaos. The Seventh Coalition, which had come together to finally put an end to Napoleon's rule, would have been forced to reconsider its position. Britain, the primary force behind anti-Napoleonic resistance, might have sought negotiations instead of continuing another costly war. Austria and Russia, already hesitant about prolonged conflict, might have been open to diplomacy rather than another drawn-out campaign. Yet, even in victory, challenges would have remained. The question of whether Napoleon could sustain his power in the long term would have depended on his ability to secure peace and rebuild trust among European nations. Nevertheless, a French victory at Waterloo would have shattered the post-Napoleonic vision that the Congress of Vienna sought to establish, leaving Europe in a state of uncertainty and setting the stage for an entirely different 19th century. The historical outcome of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, marked the end of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign and reshaped the course of European history. After escaping exile on Elba and rallying the French people behind him, Napoleon's return to power was swift, but his grip on Europe was fragile. The battle against the combined forces of Britain, Prussia, and their allies was his last attempt to restore his empire. When he failed, it led to his final downfall. Napoleon's strategy at Waterloo hinged on speed and decisive action. He aimed to strike the British forces under the Duke of Wellington before they could fully unite with the advancing Prussians under General Blücher. Early in the battle, the French had some success, with their artillery inflicting significant damage on the British lines. Waves of cavalry charges and fierce infantry assaults threatened to break Wellington's defensive position at Mont-Saint-Jean. However, key mistakes and misfortunes turned the tide against Napoleon. One of the biggest setbacks was the delayed arrival of Marshal Grouchy's forces. Tasked with holding off the Prussians, Grouchy failed to intercept them in time. This allowed Blücher's army to arrive on the battlefield in the late afternoon, reinforcing Wellington's exhausted troops. As fresh Prussian soldiers poured in, the French found themselves outnumbered and overwhelmed. The once promising battle had shifted into a disaster. The decisive moment came when the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's most elite and feared troops, launched their final attack. Expecting to break the British lines, they instead faced a well-prepared counterattack. The sight of the seemingly invincible Guard retreating sent shockwaves through the French army, triggering mass panic and collapse. The battlefield soon turned into a rout, with soldiers fleeing as Prussian forces pursued them relentlessly. Napoleon, recognizing the battle was lost, retreated to Paris, hoping to rally political and military support. But the illusion of his invincibility had been shattered. The French government, realizing that resistance was futile, forced him to abdicate for the second and final time. Within weeks, he was captured and sent into permanent exile on the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. The consequences of Waterloo were immense. With Napoleon gone, the victorious Allied powers convened to restore stability in Europe. The Congress of Vienna's efforts to redraw borders and establish a balance of power would shape the continent for decades. Britain emerged as the dominant global power, while France, once Europe's most formidable force, was humbled. The battle became a defining moment in world history, symbolizing the end of an era and the dawn of a new political order. A turning point in European history, the Battle of Waterloo was more than just the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a defining moment that reshaped the political and military landscape of Europe. It ended over 2 decades of near-constant warfare, bringing a close to the Napoleonic era and ushering in a new age of diplomacy, alliances, and relative stability. Had the battle ended differently, the entire trajectory of European history would have been altered. Before Waterloo, Europe had been locked in a struggle for dominance. The French Revolution had overturned monarchies, introduced radical political ideas, and unleashed chaos across the continent. Napoleon, rising from the revolution's turmoil, had redrawn the map of Europe, toppling kings and establishing a vast empire. His ability to outmaneuver larger, more traditional armies had made him a seemingly unstoppable force. However, by 1815, after years of war, exhaustion, and resistance from the great powers, Napoleon's grip on Europe was slipping. Waterloo was the culmination of this long struggle. The defeat of Napoleon did not simply remove a ruler. It signaled the restoration of monarchies and the establishment of a new European order. The Congress of Vienna, which had been working to reorganize Europe since Napoleon's initial fall in 1814, was able to complete its mission, restoring the Bourbon monarchy in France and reaffirming the balance of power among European nations. The victorious Allies sought to ensure that no single nation would dominate the continent as France had under Napoleon. The battle's outcome also had lasting effects on military strategy and warfare. The Napoleonic model of mass conscription, rapid maneuvering, and centralized command had revolutionized military tactics. While elements of his approach would persist, the crushing defeat at Waterloo demonstrated the growing importance of coalition warfare, logistics, and combined arms tactics. It also reinforced the idea that no single general, no matter how brilliant, could overcome the coordinated efforts of multiple great powers. Beyond the battlefield, Waterloo shaped the political ideologies of the 19th century. With Napoleon's fall, the conservative monarchies of Europe were able to suppress revolutionary movements, delaying the spread of liberal democracy and nationalism. However, the ideas ignited by the French Revolution and Napoleonic rule did not disappear. Instead, they simmered beneath the surface, eventually erupting in the revolutions of 1848 and influencing movements toward national unification in Germany and Italy. Ultimately, Waterloo was not just the defeat of a man, but the defining moment that determined the course of Europe for the next century. It marked the transition from the revolutionary upheaval of the early 19th century to an era of relative peace, diplomacy, and empire building, one that would last until the outbreak of World War I. The premise? A French victory. Imagining a French victory at Waterloo presents a fascinating alternative to the course of European history. If Napoleon had triumphed on June 18, 1815, the immediate consequences would have been dramatic, and the long-term effects could have reshaped the balance of power across the continent. Instead of marking the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo would have been the beginning of a renewed French dominance in Europe. A victory for Napoleon was not outside the realm of possibility. His initial strategy was sound. He sought to defeat the Anglo-Allied forces under Wellington before turning to face the Prussians. In the early stages of the battle, the French had moments of advantage. If Marshal Grouchy had successfully delayed or defeated Blücher's Prussian reinforcements, the battlefield could have remained in Napoleon's control. Without Prussian support, Wellington's exhausted and battered forces would have likely collapsed under the relentless pressure of French cavalry and artillery. A British retreat would have left the road to Brussels open, allowing Napoleon to claim a decisive and symbolic victory. The impact of such an outcome would have been immediate. The British army, humiliated and in disarray, might have struggled to regroup, forcing the British government to reconsider its commitment to the war. If Wellington had been captured or killed, British political resolve could have weakened further. Meanwhile, the morale of Napoleon's army and the French public would have soared. After his return from exile on Elba, many in France had viewed Napoleon's comeback as risky and uncertain. A triumphant return to Paris after Waterloo would have erased all doubts, strengthening his legitimacy and potentially securing his rule for years to come. A French victory would also have thrown the European diplomatic landscape into chaos. The Seventh Coalition, already uneasy about continued war, might have fractured. Austria and Russia, unwilling to commit to another prolonged conflict, may have sought negotiations rather than another costly campaign. Even Britain, wary of draining further resources into the conflict, could have been pressured into seeking peace. The Congress of Vienna's efforts to reshape Europe would have been undone, and Napoleon would have been in a position to dictate terms rather than suffer exile. However, long-term stability would still have been a challenge. Would Napoleon have sought peace to consolidate his rule, or would he have continued his ambitions for European dominance? Could he have secured lasting alliances, or would new coalitions have formed against him? While a victory at Waterloo would have changed history, it would not have guaranteed an indefinite French empire. Instead, it would have opened the door to a vastly different 19th century, one where Napoleon remained at the center of European affairs, shaping the future on his own terms. Chapter 2, Napoleon's Triumph. With the thunder of French cannon shaking the battlefield and the disciplined advance of his troops breaking enemy lines, Napoleon secures a decisive victory at Waterloo. The British forces, overwhelmed and exhausted, begin a disorderly retreat, while the Prussians, arriving too late to shift the tide, are forced to withdraw. As Wellington's army crumbles and Blücher's reinforcements scatter, Napoleon stands victorious. The dream of reclaiming his empire is no longer an illusion, it is reality. News of the victory spreads rapidly, reaching Paris within days. The French people, uncertain about Napoleon's return from exile just months earlier, now erupt in celebration. His triumph dispels the fears of those who doubted him and silences his political rivals. No longer just the deposed emperor making a desperate bid for power, he is once again the master of Europe's fate. His legitimacy, shaken by his initial defeat in 1814, is restored with a single battle. Soldiers who had fought alongside him for years feel renewed confidence in their leader, and fresh recruits flock to join his ranks. The morale of the French army soars, as they now believe they can stand against any enemy. On the international stage, the implications of Napoleon's victory are immediate. Britain, having suffered a humiliating defeat, faces a difficult choice. With its army in shambles and its strongest European ally crushed, does it continue the fight or seek a truce? public opinion in Britain grows divided. Some argue for a prolonged war, while others fear the cost of yet another campaign. The Seventh Coalition, already fragile, begins to fracture. Austria and Russia, having committed resources to stopping Napoleon once before, hesitate at the thought of another prolonged struggle. Instead of rallying against France, some nations reconsider their alliances. Napoleon, recognizing the opportunity, acts swiftly. Instead of marching recklessly into further wars, he extends diplomatic gestures to neutralize his enemies before they can regroup. He sends envoys to Vienna, St. Petersburg, and even London, proposing peace under terms that would allow him to remain in power while preserving stability in Europe. If successful, he could secure his reign without further conflict. However, if diplomacy fails, he knows he must prepare for another campaign. For the moment, though, France is once again under Napoleon's firm control. His triumph at Waterloo has rewritten history. He has defied exile, defeated his enemies, and reclaimed his empire. The question now is whether his victory will bring lasting stability or merely set the stage for another great war. How the French could have won. A French victory at Waterloo was not an impossibility. Napoleon, despite facing a coalition of powerful enemies, had the strategic brilliance and battlefield experience to turn the tide in his favor. The defeat he suffered was not inevitable. Several key moments could have played out differently, leading to a triumphant outcome for France. One of the most crucial factors in Napoleon's failure was the delayed arrival of Marshal Grouchy. After the initial engagement at Ligny, Napoleon ordered Grouchy to pursue and contain the Prussian forces under General Blücher, preventing them from linking up with Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. However, Grouchy moved too cautiously, failing to intercept the Prussians. This allowed Blücher to march his forces to Waterloo, reinforcing Wellington at a critical moment. Had Grouchy acted more aggressively or received clearer instructions, he could have delayed or even neutralized the Prussian reinforcements, leaving Wellington isolated and vulnerable. Timing was another major issue. Heavy rains the night before the battle forced Napoleon to delay his main attack, as he waited for the ground to dry enough for his artillery to be effective. This delay gave Wellington more time to prepare his defenses and allowed the Prussians to move closer. If Napoleon had attacked earlier in the morning, his superior artillery could have inflicted greater damage before the enemy was fully ready. The French assault on the British center might have been decisive before the Prussians even arrived. The use of cavalry also played a major role in the battle's outcome. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, ordered massive cavalry charges against Wellington's defensive squares without proper infantry or artillery support. These reckless attacks exhausted the French cavalry and failed to break the British lines. Had Napoleon coordinated his cavalry, infantry, and artillery more effectively, he could have overwhelmed Wellington's forces before they had a chance to recover. Another critical mistake was the handling of the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite and most feared unit. Instead of being used earlier when Wellington's lines were stretched thin, they were sent forward too late when the tide had already begun to turn. A better timed assault with the full force of the Imperial Guard might have shattered the Anglo-Allied center, forcing a British retreat before Blücher's Prussians arrived. In an alternate scenario where these adjustments were made, Napoleon could have secured a decisive victory. With Wellington defeated and the Prussians scattered, the road to Brussels would have been open, and the political will to continue the war might have collapsed. The course of European history would have shifted dramatically, keeping Napoleon in power and altering the fate of the continent. Wellington's retreat and Prussian collapse. Had the Battle of Waterloo unfolded differently, the sight of Wellington's forces in retreat and the Prussian army collapsing could have marked the moment Napoleon reclaimed his dominance over Europe. A few key changes in strategy, timing, and execution could have led to this outcome, leaving the Seventh Coalition in disarray and forcing Britain and its allies to reconsider their commitment to war. The British army under Wellington was stretched thin throughout the battle. holding defensive positions against relentless French assaults. Napoleon's artillery, one of the most formidable in Europe, had the potential to break through Wellington's lines if deployed more effectively and without delay. An earlier assault, rather than waiting for the muddy ground to dry, could have put overwhelming pressure on the British forces before they had time to solidify their defenses. If Wellington's center had collapsed under a well-coordinated attack, his army would have had no choice but to retreat toward Brussels in disorder. The key to ensuring British defeat would have been neutralizing the Prussians before they could intervene. Marshal Grouchy's failure to contain Blucher's forces was one of the most costly mistakes in the battle. If Grouchy had moved with greater urgency and struck the Prussians decisively at Wavre, Blucher's forces would have been too weakened or delayed to support Wellington. Without Prussian reinforcements arriving in the late afternoon, Wellington would have been left isolated, forced to fight an increasingly desperate battle against Napoleon's superior forces. Had Wellington ordered a retreat, the British army would have found itself in a dire situation. The countryside between Waterloo and Brussels offered little in the way of strong defensive positions, making an orderly withdrawal nearly impossible under French pursuit. A full-scale rout was a real possibility, with Napoleon's cavalry harassing the fleeing British troops. With Wellington's army shattered and Brussels within reach, Napoleon's victory would have been complete. At the same time, the Prussians, realizing that Wellington was no longer holding the line, could have lost their will to fight. Without the Anglo-Allied army as a buffer, Blucher's forces would have been vulnerable to a direct French assault. A determined push from Napoleon's reserves and artillery could have overwhelmed the Prussians, forcing them to abandon the battlefield. A double victory, Wellington's retreat and Prussia's collapse, would have crushed the coalition's hope of a swift end to the war. With both major opposing armies defeated, the political consequences would have been profound. Britain, unwilling to commit to another costly expedition, might have sought negotiations. Austria and Russia, hesitant to engage in another prolonged war, could have reconsidered their positions. Instead of facing exile on St. Helena, Napoleon might have returned to Paris as the undisputed ruler of France, reshaping the course of European history. The immediate aftermath on the battlefield. As the smoke cleared over the fields of Waterloo, the true cost of the battle became evident. Bodies of fallen soldiers, horses, and shattered artillery littered the muddy ground. The once peaceful Belgian countryside had been transformed into a scene of utter devastation, soaked in blood and echoing with the groans of the wounded. Whether in victory or defeat, the immediate aftermath of Waterloo was one of suffering, chaos, and irreversible change. For the defeated, retreat quickly turned into disaster. If Napoleon had lost, French troops fled in disarray, pursued mercilessly by Prussian cavalry eager for revenge. Panic spread as entire regiments dissolved, soldiers abandoning their weapons and discarding uniforms in a desperate bid to escape capture. The once proud Imperial Guard, which had never before broken in battle, found itself retreating under relentless pressure. The road to Paris was now open, and Napoleon's empire teetered on the brink of collapse. If, however, Napoleon had won, it would have been Wellington's army facing annihilation. A British retreat under heavy French pursuit would have quickly turned into a rout, with soldiers desperately trying to reach Brussels. The wounded left behind would have been at the mercy of their French victors, many of whom had long awaited revenge for years of war. Prussian forces, realizing their allies had fallen, would have either surrendered or scattered, ensuring that the Seventh Coalition's hopes of stopping Napoleon had failed. In both scenarios, the battlefield itself remained a horrifying sight. Thousands of wounded men lay across the fields, many begging for water, others too weak to call for help. Surgeons worked relentlessly in makeshift hospitals, performing amputations with little to no anesthesia. Many soldiers, whether British, French, or Prussian, knew that even if they survived their injuries, infection or disease could still claim them in the days to come. Local villagers, terrified yet forced by necessity, scavenged the battlefield for supplies, stripping the dead of valuables and equipment. For the victorious army, the aftermath was a moment of relief, but also grim realization. The cost of victory was staggering, with thousands of soldiers lost in just a single day. Officers moved through the ranks, gathering reports, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Whether Napoleon or Wellington stood victorious, the battle had reshaped the war, and Europe would never be the same. In the end, Waterloo was not just a battle but a defining moment in history. The immediate aftermath on the battlefield reflected the brutal cost of war. Victory or defeat, the dead and wounded remained, and the world would move forward forever changed. Chapter 3: The Return to Paris. The road to Paris, once filled with the confident march of Napoleon's army, now bore witness to the grim consequences of war. Whether returning in victory or defeat, the journey back to the French capital would be one of immense significance, shaping the course of Napoleon's rule and the future of France itself. If Napoleon had emerged victorious at Waterloo, his return to Paris would have been a triumph unlike any other. News of his success would have spread across the city before his arrival, igniting celebrations among the people. Supporters would have flooded the streets, cheering the emperor who had defied exile and crushed his enemies once more. The Bourbon loyalists and political opponents who had doubted his resurgence would have been silenced, forced to acknowledge his renewed grip on power. Napoleon, ever the master of spectacle, would have seized the moment, using his victory to rally the nation and reinforce his legitimacy. His speech to the people of France would have framed his triumph as proof of destiny, a sign that his empire was meant to endure. But if the battle had ended in disaster, the scene in Paris would have been vastly different. Instead of a hero's welcome, Napoleon would have returned to a city filled with fear and uncertainty. His army, broken and demoralized, would have arrived in fragments, spreading panic among the citizens. The government, already fragile, would have scrambled to determine its next course of action. Some would have called for continued resistance, while others would have urged Napoleon to abdicate once more. The once loyal crowds that had cheered his return from Elba might have now questioned whether his comeback had been a mistake. Regardless of the outcome, the return to Paris would mark a turning point. In victory, Napoleon would have had the opportunity to consolidate his power, negotiate peace, or prepare for further campaigns. His control over France would have been solidified, with his enemies forced to reckon with his continued presence on the European stage. But in defeat, his reign would have been all but over. His political opponents, sensing weakness, would have moved against him. Calls for a new government, perhaps even the restoration of the monarchy, would have grown louder. Paris, the heart of France, would have been the stage where Napoleon's fate was ultimately decided. Whether as a victorious ruler or a fallen emperor, his return would have signified the beginning of the next great chapter in his legacy, one that would determine whether France remained under his rule or prepared for yet another dramatic transformation. Napoleon's reception in France. The reception of Napoleon in France after his dramatic return from exile on Elba, and potentially after a victory at Waterloo, would have been nothing short of electrifying. His presence stirred the hearts of many, but also raised anxiety among those who feared his return to power. The duality of emotions that surged through France, excitement for some, fear for others, was a testament to Napoleon's complex relationship with the French people. In the event of a French victory at Waterloo, Napoleon's reception in Paris would have been the triumph of a hero who had defied his adversaries and returned to restore his empire. The streets would have erupted with celebration as he entered the city, greeted by enthusiastic crowds waving flags, singing, and shouting his name. Napoleon had long been seen by many as a symbol of national pride, and his victories, whether on the battlefield or in reforming France's institutions, had earned him a loyal following. For them, his return would not have been seen as a mere comeback, but as the resurgence of a leader who had brought stability and glory to France. Military officers and soldiers who had served under him would have rallied to his side, ready to fight once more to secure French dominance in Europe. Napoleon, ever the political strategist, would have made sure to align himself with key military and political leaders, reinforcing his position with fresh alliances and popular support. His rhetoric would have resonated strongly with the people, positioning his victory as an affirmation of the strength of the French nation, destined to lead Europe into a new era. However, the reception would have been more complicated for those who opposed Napoleon's return. Royalists and political rivals, still loyal to the Bourbon monarchy, would have viewed his return with deep apprehension. For them, his reappearance was a return to instability and war. Paris, divided by political allegiances, would have seen tensions rise. The Royalists would have attempted to organize their own factions, hoping for British or Austrian intervention to dethrone Napoleon once again. The threat of internal unrest, as well as the challenge of keeping a united front in a country just recovering from years of war, would have loomed large. For the French elite, there was the question of whether Napoleon would maintain his earlier promises of stability or continue to push his expansive ambitions, threatening to plunge France back into war. His reception would therefore be a careful balance, enthusiastic for some, cautiously hopeful for others, and outright hostile for his opponents. Napoleon's reception in France would have signified the nation's profound split between revolutionary ideals and royalist nostalgia, with the emperor at the center, pulling the nation in both directions. His return would not only reshape France's destiny, but reverberate across Europe, as the world watched to see whether he could hold on to power once again. Consolidating power once more. After a dramatic return to Paris, whether following a victory at Waterloo or after a bold escape from exile, Napoleon would have faced the complex task of consolidating his power in a France that had been fragmented and divided. Though he had the loyalty of his army and a considerable portion of the population, maintaining his grip on the throne would require shrewd political maneuvering, decisive military actions, and careful diplomacy. First and foremost, Napoleon needed to secure the loyalty of the military. His return would have been seen as the return of a seasoned general, capable of leading France to victory. His army, once loyal and battle-hardened, would have been crucial to his plans for consolidation. To solidify their loyalty, Napoleon would have ensured that the soldiers who had fought alongside him received favorable positions and rewards, strengthening their personal ties to him. Additionally, the recruitment of fresh troops would have been essential to building up his military power. With potential threats from both within France and from the foreign powers still aligned against him, Napoleon needed a strong, united military force to deter any opposition. Politically, Napoleon would have to work quickly to reassert his control over the government. The Bourbon monarchy, though discredited, still had powerful supporters, and royalists would have moved quickly to challenge his authority. In the wake of his return, Napoleon would have moved swiftly to neutralize any internal opposition by securing key political offices and dismissing those who had aligned themselves with the monarchy or other rival factions. He would likely have reinstated many of the reforms he had put in place during his earlier reign, such as the Napoleonic Code, to stabilize the legal framework of the country and remind the public of the benefits of his rule. Napoleon would have also sought to solidify his relationship with the French people. Public speeches, military parades, and lavish celebrations would have served to reinforce his image as a leader who had returned to protect and defend the nation. At the same time, he would have carefully cultivated an image of stability and pragmatism, emphasizing his desire to maintain peace while preparing for potential conflict. Externally, Napoleon would have sought to prevent foreign powers from exploiting any instability in France. His diplomatic strategy would likely include peace negotiations with Britain, Austria, and Russia to secure a temporary respite from the war, giving him time to strengthen his position. However, he would have known that military action could still be necessary, and he would have prepared for the possibility of renewed conflict, fortifying key borders and ensuring his military was prepared for further campaigns. In this way, Napoleon's return would have been followed by a delicate balancing act, consolidating power in the face of internal and external pressures, while securing his position as the uncontested ruler of France once more. Restoring morale and authority. After his return to power, Napoleon would have faced the monumental task of restoring morale and authority both within the French military and among the populace. The years of war, defeat, and political upheaval had taken a toll on the French people and their soldiers. Confidence in leadership had been shaken, and many were weary of the constant struggle. For Napoleon to maintain his hold on power, he needed to rebuild trust, restore his image as a decisive and capable leader, and inspire a nation on the brink of exhaustion. First, Napoleon would have focused on the military, the backbone of his empire. His soldiers, who had once revered him as a genius and a protector of France, needed reassurance. The battlefield losses, particularly the devastating defeat at Leipzig and the turmoil of the 100 Days, had left many questioning their commander's ability to deliver victory. Napoleon would have acted swiftly to boost the morale of his troops, issuing inspiring orders, ensuring they had the supplies they needed, and highlighting past victories. He would have reminded them of the glory they had achieved under his rule and of the greater cause they were fighting for, the protection and expansion of the French Empire. Through strategic speeches and military parades, he would have sought to instill a renewed sense of purpose in his army. For the civilian population, Napoleon's task was just as crucial. The people of France had lived through years of instability, and many had seen the restoration of the monarchy as a return to normalcy. With his return, Napoleon would have had to work hard to justify his rule. His political allies, particularly from the lower and middle classes, would have been essential to his strategy. By reinstating popular reforms such as the Napoleonic Code, which provided a sense of legal structure and equality, he would have gained favor with the common people. Additionally, he would have had to address the lingering fears of war. The population had experienced the horrors of prolonged conflict, and the prospect of another war with Britain or other European powers would have been unappealing. Napoleon could have offered a mixture of diplomacy and military readiness, reassuring the French people that their security was his top priority. Finally, Napoleon's authority would have been restored through his personal charisma. His presence and leadership had always been a major component of his power, and he would have capitalized on this. Carefully orchestrated public appearances, along with his ability to connect with the common soldier and citizen, would have solidified his role as the leader capable of bringing stability and glory back to France. Restoring morale and authority would not have been a quick process, but Napoleon's skill in navigating political, military, and social dynamics would have played a pivotal role in securing his position and ensuring that France remained under his control. Chapter 4: The European Response. Napoleon's return to power in France would have sent shockwaves through Europe, prompting immediate and dramatic responses from the continent's leading powers. For the nations that had been part of the Seventh Coalition, Napoleon's comeback was not merely a political challenge. It was a direct threat to the balance of power they had worked so hard to maintain since his initial abdication in 1814. The reaction of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia would have been swift, calculated, and shaped by a mix of fear, desperation, and political calculation. First, Britain, under the leadership of the Duke of Wellington, would have seen Napoleon's return as an existential threat. The British government, which had heavily invested in defeating Napoleon over the previous decade, was determined not to allow him to regain control of Europe. Their response would have been immediate and focused on mobilizing resources for another military campaign. The British Navy, one of the most powerful in the world at the time, would have positioned itself for a blockade, aiming to cut off France from critical supplies and reinforcements. On land, Wellington would have worked to assemble a coalition of European powers to confront Napoleon, just as he had in the past. Prussia, under the leadership of Field Marshal Blücher, would have also seen the return of Napoleon as a grave threat. Having experienced firsthand the devastation of Napoleon's conquests, Prussia would have immediately sought to rebuild its forces and prepare for war. Blücher, a seasoned general, would have sought to rally both the Prussian army and its allies to strike at Napoleon quickly, preventing him from consolidating his position in France. The memory of previous invasions would have made the Prussians particularly eager to re-enter the conflict, hoping to cripple Napoleon once and for all. Austria, with its complex political landscape and recent experience with Napoleon's aggressive expansion, would have taken a more cautious but still resolute approach. Emperor Francis I would have weighed the risks carefully, knowing that any direct confrontation with Napoleon could lead to widespread destruction across Europe. Nevertheless, Austria's alliances with Britain and Prussia, as well as its historical opposition to French hegemony, would have led them to pledge military support against Napoleon. Diplomatic channels would have remained open, but Austria would have been prepared for war should negotiations fail. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, would have been equally alarmed by Napoleon's return. Russia had been a central player in Napoleon's downfall after the disastrous invasion of 1812, and the specter of his resurgence would have prompted the Russian Empire to act decisively. The Russian response would have involved both military mobilization and diplomatic pressure, using its influence in Eastern Europe to rally further support against Napoleon's regime. In conclusion, the European response to Napoleon's return would have been one of alarm and resolve. The major powers would have swiftly aligned themselves to confront the emperor once again, determined to prevent the return of his empire. However, with Napoleon's skill in both warfare and diplomacy, the outcome of this renewed struggle for dominance in Europe was far from certain. Britain's dilemma: fight or negotiate. When Napoleon returned to France in 1815, Britain faced a difficult and delicate dilemma. Should they continue their relentless military campaign against the former emperor, or seek a negotiated settlement that might avoid further bloodshed? The stakes were high, and the decisions made in London would have significant consequences for the future of Europe. On one hand, the British government, led by Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, and with the military under the command of the Duke of Wellington, had a long history of resistance to Napoleon. Britain had spent years fighting to curb his expansionist ambitions, pouring resources into the coalitions that had opposed him. Napoleon's return to power threatened to undo everything they had achieved. The British, along with their allies, had been instrumental in the downfall of Napoleon during the War of the Sixth Coalition, and the thought of him regaining control of France and potentially restarting his conquests was seen as a direct threat to European stability and British national security. Many in the British government, particularly hawks in Parliament, would have argued that the only viable option was war, to prevent Napoleon from reclaiming his empire and destabilizing Europe once again. On the other hand, there was a growing weariness among the British public and some factions of the political elite. The Napoleonic Wars had been long, expensive, and devastating, with Britain having suffered heavy losses in both lives and treasure. The cost of war was beginning to take its toll, and many were eager for peace. There was also the realization that Napoleon's power might not last for long. His empire was already fragile, and a new war could prove difficult to sustain in the face of mounting resistance both from Europe and within France itself. Negotiating with Napoleon, or at least exploring a diplomatic solution, could offer a way to stabilize the situation without another grueling campaign. However, any attempt at negotiation would have been fraught with uncertainty, as it was unclear whether Napoleon would accept terms or if the other powers, such as Austria, Russia, and Prussia, would support a negotiated peace with him. Britain's dilemma was compounded by the diplomatic dynamics in Europe. France was once again the center of European politics, and Britain's long-standing allies, such as Prussia and Austria, had their own interests and calculations. While the British were keen to prevent Napoleon from reestablishing dominance, they also recognized that their own interests would be tied to the broader European balance of power. If negotiations were to happen, Britain needed to be cautious, ensuring that its interests, particularly naval dominance and colonial expansion, were protected in any future peace settlement. In the end, the British government chose to fight, seeing no alternative that could guarantee their security and the future of Europe. The result was the Battle of Waterloo, a decisive confrontation that would once again determine the fate of Napoleon and the course of European history. But even in the heat of war, the question of whether negotiations might have prevented such a conflict remained a lingering possibility, one that history would reflect upon with uncertainty. Prussia, Austria, and Russia reconsider. As Napoleon's return to power sent shockwaves across Europe, the great powers of Prussia, Austria, and Russia were faced with a complex dilemma. Having already spent years fighting against the French emperor and bearing the immense costs of the Napoleonic Wars, each of these nations would have had to reconsider their stance and strategy in response to his dramatic resurgence. While the immediate reaction was alarm and the desire to confront him once again, deeper calculations were also at play, prompting some to reconsider the approach they had taken in the past. Prussia, under the leadership of King Friedrich Wilhelm III and Field Marshal Blücher, had already suffered greatly in the previous wars against Napoleon. Their military had been decimated during the disastrous campaigns of 1812 and 1813, and although they had emerged from the struggle with a restored position, their resolve was far from unshakable. The Prussian leadership, although wary of Napoleon's ability to rekindle his empire, would have been aware that another protracted war could lead to further devastation. Still, given the historical enmity between Prussia and Napoleon, especially after the loss at Jena Auerstedt in 1806, Prussia was unlikely to passively accept Napoleon's return. However, some in Prussia may have entertained the idea of negotiating with Napoleon, should it present an opportunity for a favorable settlement, particularly if France's military position seemed weaker, or if the coalition's unity was in question. Austria, led by Emperor Francis I and Foreign Minister Metternich, had been deeply affected by Napoleon's expansionist policies. However, Austria was also politically astute enough to understand the changing tides of European power. Metternich, the key architect of European diplomacy during this period, was keenly aware that a war with Napoleon might not serve Austrian interests in the long run. Austria had already experienced the high costs of Napoleon's earlier campaigns, and a war of attrition could potentially destabilize the empire, particularly with rising nationalist sentiments within its own borders. For Metternich, diplomacy was key, and Austria might have considered a more cautious approach, attempting to engage Napoleon in talks to secure a balance of power in Europe, even if it meant temporarily tolerating his rule. Russia's position was equally complex. Tsar Alexander I, who had once been a close ally of Napoleon, but had seen the horrors of his invasion of Russia in 1812, would have been deeply concerned by Napoleon's return. The Russian Empire had borne the brunt of Napoleon's campaigns and had lost tens of thousands of soldiers during the campaigns in Eastern Europe. However, Russia's vast size and military capability made it an indomitable force, and Tsar Alexander was aware that Russia could, if necessary, fight again. Still, the Russian leadership would have also understood the strategic importance of avoiding a prolonged conflict with France. Negotiating with Napoleon, or at least managing the situation in such a way that Russia could retain its influence over Eastern Europe, would have been tempting, especially if France showed signs of internal instability or if other powers hesitated. As Prussia, Austria, and Russia reconsidered their approaches to Napoleon's return, a delicate balance between military action and diplomatic engagement emerged. While initial reactions favored military intervention, especially from Britain, deeper political and strategic considerations encouraged each of these powers to think carefully about the broader consequences of another war with Napoleon. The prospect of negotiating a settlement or finding ways to contain Napoleon without full-scale war remained a point of strategic interest for these nations, especially as they considered their future influence in Europe. Ultimately, the alliance between these powers would hold firm, but the internal debates about the best course of action highlighted the complexity of dealing with a leader like Napoleon. Would the Congress of Vienna collapse? The return of Napoleon to the French throne in 1815 presented a grave challenge to the delicate balance of power that had been carefully crafted at the Congress of Vienna just months earlier. The Congress, which had convened after Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, sought to redraw the map of Europe and restore the pre-war order by re-establishing monarchies, containing French power and suppressing revolutionary ideals. The leaders of Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia had worked tirelessly to create a stable, peaceful Europe, but Napoleon's return threatened to unravel their hard-won agreements and plunge the continent back into war. The immediate question was whether the Congress of Vienna itself would collapse under the pressure of Napoleon's resurgence. The Congress was more than just a series of treaties. It was the embodiment of a new European order, one that sought to prevent any one power, particularly France, from dominating the continent again. The legitimacy of the Congress rested on the acceptance of the new political realities that had been imposed upon Europe, realities that Napoleon had vehemently rejected in his attempt to regain control of France. In the short term, Napoleon's return would have put immense strain on the alliances that had been formed at Vienna. Prussia, Austria, and Russia, all of which had been instrumental in the defeat of Napoleon, would have had to reassess their priorities. Would they adhere to the agreements reached at Vienna, which were designed to prevent any future French aggression, or would they seek to re-engage with the unpredictable and charismatic figure of Napoleon? While the Congress itself had intended to stabilize Europe through diplomacy and mutual cooperation, the new crisis called into question whether the powers involved could maintain their unity in the face of a renewed French threat. Moreover, the public perception of the Congress of Vienna could also have been shaken. The Austrian Empire, which had been a leading force at the Congress, would have faced significant pressure from both internal and external forces. The Austrian government had tried to impose conservative, monarchic values throughout Europe, but with Napoleon's return, any hope of maintaining a peaceful, stable European system was called into question. Austria's position, along with that of the other powers, was vulnerable, as Napoleon's ability to inspire both loyalty and fear among his soldiers and the French people could potentially destabilize the power dynamics established in Vienna. Yet, despite the looming threat, the Congress did not collapse entirely. The key powers, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, ultimately managed to hold their coalition together, if only through pragmatic military action and the realization that the future of Europe depended on their ability to confront Napoleon decisively. However, the threat posed by Napoleon's return exposed the fragility of the peace agreements made at Vienna and highlighted the limits of diplomacy in the face of such a dominant and charismatic figure. While the Congress of Vienna did not collapse outright, its ability to enforce lasting peace and stability in Europe was severely tested. Chapter 5: A Second Napoleonic Empire. Following his dramatic return to power in 1815, Napoleon's vision of re-establishing a French empire was no longer a distant dream. With the French army rallying behind him and the monarchy in disarray, Napoleon sought to solidify his position by reviving the imperial system he had once built, albeit under much more challenging circumstances. The creation of a second Napoleonic empire was not only a reflection of his unyielding ambition, but also a response to the rapidly shifting political and military landscape across Europe. The foundation of this new empire began with Napoleon's efforts to consolidate power within France. Unlike his first reign, which was marked by swift military victories and vast territorial expansion, his second empire would have been more focused on reinforcing internal stability. Napoleon's return was supported by many of his old allies, including loyalists in the military and the administration, but his power was far from secure. In the wake of years of political and social unrest, Napoleon needed to ensure that both the aristocracy and the common people saw him as the legitimate ruler of France. One of the first steps in building this new empire would have been a reorganization of French society. Napoleon could have relied on his previous reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, which had codified laws and granted certain rights to citizens. Restoring confidence in the stability of French governance would have been crucial in keeping both internal dissent and foreign intervention at bay. Additionally, Napoleon would likely have sought to further centralize control, strengthening the administrative structures that he had developed during his first reign. This would have included reinstating the civil service, reinforcing the military hierarchy, and securing the loyalty of key political figures. Simultaneously, Napoleon would have had to rebuild his military forces. His army had been depleted over the course of the previous wars, and although many soldiers remained loyal to him, France's military capacity was significantly diminished compared to its previous strength. Napoleon's ability to quickly raise and equip a new army would have been critical for securing his position, especially in the face of the impending coalition of European powers. He would have relied on his experience as a military commander to rapidly reorganize France's military forces, possibly even calling for the conscription of young men to replenish the ranks. On the international front, the creation of a second Napoleonic empire would have meant confronting the European powers who were already preparing to march on France. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, each with their own interests and motives, would not have been willing to tolerate a revived Napoleonic France for long. Napoleon's immediate challenge would have been to either negotiate or fight these powers to ensure the survival of his empire. The outcome of this struggle would determine whether his second empire could endure or would collapse under the weight of external opposition. In sum, the establishment of a second Napoleonic empire was not just a revival of his old dreams, but a pragmatic effort to rebuild a crumbling nation in the face of overwhelming odds. Napoleon would have needed to navigate political, military, and diplomatic challenges at home and abroad in order to secure his empire and reassert French dominance in Europe. Strengthening internal rule. In the wake of his return to power, Napoleon faced the immediate challenge of strengthening his internal rule over a France that had undergone significant changes since his abdication in 1814. The monarchy, while briefly restored under Louis XVIII, had left a deeply divided nation. Many in the political class and military remained loyal to Napoleon, but there were still factions who preferred the stability of the Bourbon monarchy or sought to preserve their own power. To ensure the longevity of his second empire, Napoleon would have needed to consolidate his control over all aspects of French society, political, social, and military. The first step in strengthening his internal rule would have been to secure the loyalty of the French military. During his first reign, the army had been one of his greatest assets, a disciplined and formidable force that had propelled France to the height of its power. After his exile, however, many of the seasoned officers were either dead or disgraced, and much of the military apparatus was in disarray. Napoleon would have immediately set about rebuilding the army, reestablishing conscription to replenish the ranks, and ensuring that veterans and new recruits alike were loyal to him. As a charismatic military leader, Napoleon would have relied on his personal reputation to rally the troops, emphasizing the defense of France from foreign invaders and portraying himself as the true guardian of French greatness. Internally, Napoleon would have worked to stabilize the political landscape. During his first empire, he had centralized power within the state, dismantling the influence of the nobility and replacing it with a meritocratic bureaucracy loyal to him. In his second reign, Napoleon would have needed to do the same, although the political situation had shifted. The French people, exhausted from years of turmoil, might have been more receptive to his authoritarian leadership if he could promise them stability and prosperity. Napoleon would have likely appealed to the middle class or bourgeoisie who had benefited from his previous reforms. His earlier establishment of the Napoleonic Code, which provided a uniform legal system, had already won him some support, and he could have used this as a foundation to secure his authority. Socially, Napoleon would have sought to bridge the divide between the various factions within French society. While the aristocracy had been largely disempowered during his first reign, some elements of the nobility still held significant influence, particularly in the provinces. Reassuring the aristocracy while maintaining control over them would have been a delicate balancing act. At the same time, Napoleon would have continued to promote the ideals of the Revolution, positioning himself as the protector of Republican values, particularly liberty, equality, and fraternity, albeit under his own rule. Napoleon would also have focused on maintaining social order. He had previously reformed the French education system, promoted infrastructure projects, and initiated public works. Reestablishing economic stability would have been vital to winning over public support, and a revived French economy could have been used to consolidate his power. Strengthening internal rule would have meant securing the loyalty of the nation's various classes and factions, stabilizing the economy, and ensuring that his leadership was seen as both legitimate and effective. Without this internal consolidation, the external threats from the rest of Europe would have been insurmountable. Military reforms and consolidation. In the aftermath of Napoleon's return to power in 1815, one of his primary concerns was the rebuilding and strengthening of the French military. Having been exiled for a year, much of France's military structure had weakened. The armies that had once commanded Europe were now fragmented, underfunded, and in need of immediate revitalization. Napoleon's success in reestablishing his rule hinged on his ability to quickly reform the military, consolidating its strength and loyalty to secure France's borders and face the impending European coalition. The first priority would have been the recruitment and training of new soldiers. Napoleon's previous army, composed of well-trained veterans, had been decimated during the wars leading up to his abdication. To replenish the ranks, Napoleon would likely have revived conscription, mobilizing young men across the nation for military service. This strategy would have also allowed him to reintroduce the sense of national duty that had been prevalent during his first empire, ensuring that the new army was not only large, but also ideologically aligned with his vision of a unified, strong France. Reorganization of the military structure would have been another key step in consolidating military power. Napoleon was known for his military genius, particularly in terms of operational efficiency. The army would have been restructured with a strong emphasis on corps-level organization, allowing for greater mobility and flexibility in the field. This military hierarchy, which Napoleon had established during his first reign, was highly effective in coordinating large, multi-divisional operations. He would have quickly reorganized the command structure, appointing loyal and capable officers to key positions, and ensuring that the military remained well-disciplined and focused on his objectives. In addition to rebuilding the army, Napoleon would have needed to consolidate his control over the military-industrial infrastructure. The French war machine had to be resupplied, and arms factories, munitions depots, and logistical networks would have been key areas of focus. Re-establishing France as a self-sufficient military power meant ensuring that weapons, uniforms, and supplies were produced in sufficient quantity to support both defensive and offensive operations. Napoleon had learned from his earlier campaigns the importance of supply lines, and the logistical planning for his new army would have been designed to avoid the same issues that had plagued his earlier campaigns, such as shortages of provisions. Napoleon's consolidation efforts would also have focused on morale and discipline within the ranks. The French military had always been known for its strong esprit de corps, and Napoleon would have worked to foster this once more. By invoking his legacy as the defender of France and champion of the revolution's ideals, he could have motivated his troops to fight fiercely for his vision of the empire. In addition, Napoleon would have ensured that his soldiers were trained to the highest standards, employing a combination of rigorous drills and battle simulations to prepare them for the challenges of a war with Europe's great powers. Ultimately, the success of Napoleon's military reforms and consolidation depended on his ability to act swiftly and decisively. His greatest strength had always been his mastery of warfare, and with these reforms, he would have sought to recreate a force capable of taking on the combined might of Europe's coalitions. Rebuilding the army, restructuring its command, and ensuring logistical efficiency were essential steps in securing the future of the Second Napoleonic Empire. Political challenges within France. After Napoleon's dramatic return to power in 1815, his biggest political challenge lay within France itself. While many in the country were loyal to him, particularly among the military and the working classes, the political landscape was far from unified. France had just emerged from a period of instability, with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XIII, which had been a source of division and tension. Napoleon's return did not erase these political fractures, and his reign would have been complicated by the need to manage a deeply divided nation. One of the primary political challenges Napoleon faced was the question of legitimacy. While he had once been the undisputed ruler of France, the political environment had changed. The monarchy, even in its restored form, had a significant amount of support, especially among the conservative factions of society, the aristocracy, and those who had benefited from the post-revolutionary stability. Napoleon's return to power was perceived by many as a destabilizing force, not just by foreign powers, but by a portion of the French population as well. The key to his political survival was to convince the nation that his rule was not a return to autocracy, but a necessary safeguard against the chaos of foreign intervention and internal disunity. Napoleon's internal political challenges also included the need to manage the competing factions within his own government. There were those who remained loyal to him out of respect for his previous accomplishments, and then there were others, especially those from the new Bourbon-supporting elite, who saw Napoleon as a threat to the status quo. These factions were at odds over several key issues, including the future of France's political system. Would the country return to an absolutist monarchy, or would it continue to function under a system that Napoleon had shaped, where centralized power and strong state control dominated? Additionally, Napoleon had to balance his relationship with the military elite. Many of his former generals were still in positions of power, but some had seen their fortunes rise under the restored monarchy and were now reluctant to support his return. Napoleon would need to manage these military figures carefully, either co-opting them into his government or neutralizing potential rivals, to avoid the risk of a military coup or internal rebellion. Finally, Napoleon faced the challenge of maintaining public support. Although many in France were still loyal to the ideals of the revolution and saw Napoleon as a symbol of stability, others were weary of the constant state of warfare that had marked his earlier rule. To maintain political cohesion, Napoleon would have had to appease the more moderate factions and reassure the general population that his rule would not plunge them back into war, but instead provide peace and prosperity. This delicate balance between military, political, and public interests would define the political landscape of his second reign. Chapter 6: The Fate of Britain. In a world where Napoleon triumphed at Waterloo and restored the French Empire, Britain faced an uncertain future. Having been a key player in the coalition that defeated Napoleon in the first place, Britain had long been an adversary of the French Empire. However, with Napoleon back on the throne in Paris, the British government was faced with a dilemma that would determine not just the future of France, but the fate of the entire European balance of power. The most immediate concern for Britain was its security. Having been at the forefront of the struggle against Napoleon during his first reign, Britain was aware of the threat a resurgent France posed. With Napoleon's military genius and aggressive tactics still fresh in the memory of Europe, Britain could not afford to be complacent. The British Isles had been a crucial base for the coalition armies in the past, but in this new scenario, Britain would have to prepare for the possibility of a French invasion. A renewed French fleet, bolstered by Napoleon's reforms and potentially aided by new alliances, could threaten British control of the seas. Napoleon would have likely sought to weaken Britain economically by disrupting its trade routes, as he had done in his earlier campaigns with the continental system. The economic impact of this, alongside the threat of invasion, would have driven Britain to bolster its defenses. Another issue for Britain was its political landscape. The British government, led by the Tories under Lord Liverpool, was initially hostile to the idea of negotiating with Napoleon. However, the sheer scale of the challenge posed by a second Napoleonic empire might have forced the British to reconsider their stance. Would Britain continue to fight a protracted war against France, or would it seek a diplomatic solution? The Tories were deeply committed to the anti-Napoleonic cause, but the cost of war could push them to the negotiating table. Public opinion in Britain was also divided. The prolonged wars had strained the British economy, and the loss of life during the Napoleonic Wars had left the population weary of further conflict. The rising cost of maintaining a large military could prompt calls for peace, as a significant portion of the population longed for stability and prosperity after years of war. Additionally, Britain's global empire was a key factor in its strategic calculations. While the focus was on the European continent, Britain's colonies around the world, especially in India and the Caribbean, were of immense importance. Napoleon's influence could have extended beyond Europe, potentially encouraging revolts or undermining British interests in these territories. Britain's colonial reach would have been tested, requiring Britain to balance its efforts in Europe with the preservation of its imperial dominance. Ultimately, Britain's fate in this alternate reality would have depended on the decisions of its leaders. The prospect of negotiation, a tactical retreat, or continued warfare would have shaped the future of the nation. Regardless of the path Britain chose, it would have been forced to confront the rise of a second Napoleonic empire, and the political, military, and economic ramifications would resonate far beyond Europe's borders. Would Britain seek peace? In a scenario where Napoleon emerged victorious at Waterloo and restored his empire, Britain would have faced a profound decision: continue the war or seek peace. The answer was far from simple, as Britain's leadership and public opinion would have played a critical role in determining the country's course of action. In the immediate aftermath of Napoleon's victory, Britain would have been under considerable pressure to continue its fight against France. Napoleon's resurgence represented a serious threat to the European balance of power, and for Britain, the idea of a dominant France controlling most of the continent was unthinkable. Historically, Britain had maintained a policy of preventing any single nation from gaining such hegemony in Europe, and a renewed Napoleonic empire would challenge this long-standing approach. However, the cost of continued warfare had weighed heavily on Britain since the start of the Napoleonic Wars, and with France reasserting its power, Britain might have been forced to reconsider its position. One major factor influencing Britain's decision would have been the economic and social toll of the Napoleonic Wars. By 1815, Britain had been at war for over 2 decades, and the strain on its economy was severe. War-related debts were at unprecedented levels, and the cost of maintaining a standing army, navy, and supporting coalitions against France was stretching the British treasury to its limits. For the British public, which had endured the hardships of war, including rationing and high taxation, the prospect of further conflict with no end in sight might have driven a desire for peace. Additionally, the impact of Napoleon's strategic brilliance and the threat he posed would have been a key consideration. Napoleon had proven time and again that he could outmaneuver his enemies, and his ability to rally the French people around his cause could sway public opinion in Britain. If Britain had been unable to defeat France decisively on the battlefield, the pressure to negotiate a peace settlement would have grown. Another factor that would have influenced Britain's decision was the military situation. While the British military was formidable, its resources were stretched thin across various global theaters, from India to the Americas. Fighting a two-front war against a resurgent France in Europe and maintaining its colonial holdings would have been a daunting task. In such a scenario, Britain may have been forced to choose between securing peace in Europe and preserving its global interests. Diplomatically, Britain had historically shown pragmatism in its foreign policy. While the idea of negotiating with Napoleon would have been unpopular in certain circles, Britain might have recognized the futility of endless war. A peace settlement with France would have provided Britain with the opportunity to focus on rebuilding its economy and restoring stability at home, all while ensuring that its interests abroad were protected. Ultimately, while the initial response would have likely been resistance, the overwhelming strain on Britain's resources and the political divisions within the country might have led to a peace negotiation with Napoleon. The question of whether Britain would seek peace would have hinged on the balance of military, economic, and diplomatic pressures that made continued war a far less appealing option than negotiating a settlement with the French Empire. The impact on British politics. The return of Napoleon to power and the shifting dynamics of Europe would have had a profound impact on British politics. For much of the 19th century, British politics had been shaped by the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon's resurgence would only heighten the political divisions that had emerged during the conflict. With the future of Europe hanging in the balance, political factions within Britain would be forced to reconsider their stance on war, peace, and the country's future role on the continent. At the heart of the political discourse would have been the decision of whether to continue the war or negotiate with France. The Tory government, led by Lord Liverpool, had been firmly committed to fighting Napoleon and upholding British interests in Europe. However, with Napoleon's victory at Waterloo and his return to power, this commitment would have been severely tested. The Tory party, which had traditionally favored military intervention, might have faced internal divisions over the cost of continued war. The mounting economic pressure, the heavy toll on the population, and the possibility of further conflict might have pushed some members of the party to reconsider their stance. On the other hand, the Whigs, who had long been more sympathetic to peace negotiations, would have seen this as an opportunity to push for a diplomatic resolution. They had criticized the government's handling of the war, particularly its economic consequences, and may have gained significant political traction by advocating for peace with Napoleon. The Whigs would have framed peace talks as a way to end the financial strain on Britain and to prevent further bloodshed. Their position would have resonated with a public exhausted by years of war and economic hardship, leading to growing support for a shift in policy. Public opinion, a key factor in British politics, would have been deeply divided. While the Tory party's traditional support base was made up of those committed to defeating Napoleon, the general population was weary of war. The impact of the wars on British families, the economic difficulties, and the loss of life would have caused many to question the wisdom of continuing the conflict. The strain of war also contributed to a rise in radical political movements, with some factions advocating for reforms to alleviate social unrest. These movements could have exerted pressure on the government to seek peace and potentially to reform the political system in response to widespread dissatisfaction. The threat of further wars in Europe would have also influenced the balance of power within Britain. The rising influence of military leaders and their role in politics, as well as the growing influence of naval power, would have changed the political landscape. Key figures in the military might have gained more political leverage, especially if they were able to secure victories or maintain national security. This could have led to a shift in the traditional power structures, with military figures gaining prominence in government. Ultimately, the political impact of Napoleon's return would have been felt across all levels of British society. The tension between war and peace, the strain on the economy, and the shifting power dynamics within the government would have led to a period of intense political debate. The outcome of this debate could have shaped Britain's future approach to foreign policy, military strategy, and domestic reforms in the years to come. The Royal Navy and global strategy. In the aftermath of Napoleon's return to power, Britain's Royal Navy would have played a central role in shaping the nation's global strategy. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy had been a crucial pillar of British power, ensuring control of the seas and protecting vital trade routes. With Napoleon's resurgence, maintaining naval dominance would become even more critical, as Britain faced the possibility of a new wave of conflict with France, while also needing to secure its interests around the world. Napoleon's strategy had always been to challenge Britain's supremacy at sea, particularly through the French fleet, which had been a threat in earlier years. A resurgent France under Napoleon would likely attempt to rebuild its navy and increase its influence over European and Mediterranean waters. Britain, as the undisputed naval power, would have had to focus its resources on ensuring that the French Navy remained inferior, while also safeguarding its colonial empire. The Royal Navy would have needed to counter any French naval operations aimed at disrupting British trade or launching an invasion of Britain itself. The geopolitical environment would have made Britain's naval strength even more essential. With a renewed French Empire in control of large parts of Europe, Britain would need to focus on securing its maritime trade routes. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the seas around Africa would have been critical theaters of conflict. Britain's colonial empire was vast and included territories in India, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. Protecting these colonies from potential French influence, as well as ensuring that trade with these regions remained uninterrupted, would have been a key priority for the Royal Navy. Britain's naval superiority had traditionally been its most effective tool in projecting power globally, and under a new Napoleonic empire, the Royal Navy would need to adapt to the shifting geopolitical realities. The naval blockade, a tactic used by Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, would continue to be an essential tool for economic warfare. By cutting off France from essential trade and resources, the British could weaken Napoleon's economic base without directly engaging in ground battles. A strengthened French Navy would challenge Britain's ability to maintain these blockades, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Moreover, Britain's global strategy would have included new diplomatic alliances and the possibility of engaging in proxy conflicts across the globe. In Asia, for instance, Britain's control over India would have been vital to preventing French encroachment, while the Caribbean would continue to be a crucial region for Britain's sugar trade. The Royal Navy would need to maintain a presence in all these regions, ensuring that French influence did not disrupt British global trade. The strategic importance of the Royal Navy would extend beyond defense. It would also serve as a tool for British diplomacy, helping to maintain influence in regions of the world vital to Britain's economic and political power. As a result, the Royal Navy would have to remain an agile, forward-thinking force, capable of responding to both the immediate threat from Napoleon and the long-term needs of Britain's global strategy. Chapter 7, The Balance of Power in Europe. With Napoleon's victory at Waterloo and the subsequent restoration of his empire, the delicate balance of power in Europe was dramatically altered. The Napoleonic Wars had already reshaped the continent, and a second Napoleonic Empire would create an even more unstable environment, potentially tipping the scales in France's favor. The traditional balance of power, established through a system of coalitions and shifting alliances, would need to be redefined as European powers responded to the growing threat of a renewed French dominance. The concept of the balance of power had long been central to European diplomacy. Throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, nations sought to prevent any one state from becoming so powerful that it could dominate the others. For Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 had been seen as a successful preservation of this balance. The Congress of Vienna, which followed Napoleon's initial exile, aimed to restore peace and stability by creating a new order that would ensure no single power could easily overpower the rest. With Napoleon's return, this fragile peace was at risk, and Europe's great powers would have to reassess their strategies. A second Napoleonic Empire would force a shift in the balance of power. France, once again under Napoleon's control, would quickly reassert itself as a dominant force in Europe. The immediate concern for Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia would be how to prevent France from regaining the hegemonic position it once held. France's vast resources, military prowess, and strategic position made it a formidable adversary, and the other European powers would need to find ways to contain this resurgence. The formation of new coalitions or the reinforcement of existing ones would be necessary to counterbalance France's influence. Historically, the major European powers had worked together to contain Napoleon, but now they would be faced with the challenge of determining whether their alliances should remain intact or be restructured in response to the new reality. The goal would be to create a system where no single nation could overpower the others, but the rise of Napoleon once again would force some nations into uncomfortable partnerships. For Britain, the key to preserving the balance of power would lie in maintaining its naval supremacy and preventing France from gaining control over the continent. The British would likely continue their policy of forming coalitions with other European powers, but these alliances might be strained due to competing interests. Austria, Prussia, and Russia, with their varying ambitions, would have their own concerns regarding French power, and the success of any coalition would depend on how well these diverse interests could be aligned. At the same time, the potential for further conflict between the European powers would increase, as any move made by one nation to increase its power could be perceived as a threat by others. The competition for influence in Europe would likely lead to a more volatile and fragmented diplomatic landscape. The balance of power, while intended to create stability, would now be constantly in flux, with the shadow of Napoleon's empire looming over all of Europe. The future of the continent would depend on the ability of its powers to adapt to these new challenges and prevent any single state from achieving unchecked dominance. A new coalition or a new peace? In the wake of Napoleon's return to power and the emergence of a second Napoleonic Empire, the question facing Europe's great powers would have been whether to form a new coalition to counterbalance France or to seek a new peace settlement that could ensure stability. The traditional approach to European diplomacy had been through shifting alliances, where coalitions of states formed in response to perceived threats. However, after years of war and immense destruction, the prospect of continued conflict might have led to calls for a new peace, one that could potentially offer a more lasting solution to the tensions between France and the rest of Europe. The formation of a new coalition would have been a logical first step for the major powers in Europe. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, who had previously fought against Napoleon in the Sixth Coalition, would likely have been the key players in any renewed alliance. The objective of such a coalition would have been to contain Napoleon's resurgence, ensuring that France did not regain the dominance it had previously held over Europe. The military strategy of the coalition would have focused on isolating France, limiting its territorial expansion, and cutting off its ability to wage war effectively. A renewed coalition might have seen the reintroduction of old alliances and military strategies, such as naval blockades, and the support of insurgencies in France's occupied territories. However, the strain of continuous warfare over the preceding decades could have made a new coalition less appealing. The wars had devastated economies, led to immense loss of life, and left populations exhausted and war-weary. As a result, some European powers, particularly Britain and Austria, might have been more inclined to seek a peace settlement rather than prolong the conflict. A new peace could have involved a diplomatic resolution where both Napoleon's France and the other European powers agreed to certain compromises in exchange for the cessation of hostilities. In such a scenario, the major powers might have focused on creating a new balance of power in Europe that could prevent the dominance of any one nation, while still allowing France to maintain a certain level of influence. The challenges of forming a new peace, however, would have been considerable. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, would likely have demanded terms that were favorable to France, and it is unlikely that the other powers would have easily agreed to a settlement that allowed for French dominance. Additionally, public opinion in Britain and the other European nations would have been a significant factor. The memory of Napoleon's previous conquests and the deep-seated desire to prevent the reemergence of a French empire would have made peace negotiations highly contentious. Ultimately, the decision between a new coalition and a new peace would have depended on a complex mix of military, diplomatic, and economic factors. If the major powers saw the cost of continued war as too high, a peace agreement might have been the preferred option. However, if they believed that France's power could only be contained through military force, the formation of a new coalition would have been the most likely outcome. In either case, Europe's future would have been shaped by the response to Napoleon's return and the strategies employed by the continent's great powers. The shifting alliances of the continent. With Napoleon's return to power and the establishment of a second Napoleonic Empire, the political and military landscape of Europe would have been thrown into flux once again. For centuries, the system of shifting alliances had been a defining feature of European diplomacy, where states would form coalitions based on common interests or to balance against perceived threats. Napoleon's resurgence would exacerbate this system of fluid alliances, as countries sought to either contain or align themselves with France, depending on their strategic priorities. The first major shift in alliances would likely have been the response of Britain. As a naval power with extensive global interests, Britain's priority was to prevent France from achieving any form of continental dominance. While Britain had previously fought against France, the possibility of a second Napoleonic Empire might have forced Britain into recalibrating its alliances with other European powers. For instance, Britain might have renewed or strengthened its ties with Russia and Prussia, which had long been rivals to France. This coalition would aim to contain French power by maintaining military pressure on France and securing British maritime interests. At the same time, Austria, which had been part of the coalitions against Napoleon, would have been in a more precarious position. While Austria shared a common interest with Britain in opposing French domination, the Habsburg Empire had a history of fluctuating alliances and may have been tempted to pursue more neutral or even pro-French diplomacy if it saw an opportunity to safeguard its own territory and power within Central Europe. Austria's participation in the new European order would have depended on the shifting balance of power, and it could have sought to leverage its position as a mediator or broker to secure favorable terms. Russia, which had been a key member of the anti-Napoleonic coalitions, would have faced its own dilemma. The Russian Empire, led by Tsar Alexander I, had long sought to expand its influence over Eastern Europe. The question of whether to continue aligning with Britain or consider negotiations with France would have been at the forefront of Russian diplomacy. Russia's vast resources, including its military might, would have given it considerable leverage in shaping the future of Europe. In this new era, Russia could have played a pivotal role in either a new coalition or a peace settlement, depending on how its interests aligned with those of Britain or France. Prussia, traditionally a rival to France, would have faced similar challenges. Prussia had gained significant territory after Napoleon's initial defeat, and its leaders would have to consider whether to support a new coalition against France or pursue a more independent foreign policy. Prussia's growing strength would have made it a key player in any shifting alliances, but its decision to back one side or the other would have been influenced by its strategic goals, including maintaining its territorial gains and expanding its influence in Central Europe. The shifting alliances of the continent would have been marked by a delicate balance of competing interests, as each power navigated the resurgence of Napoleon and sought to secure its place in the post-war European order. The complexity of these relationships would have meant that no alliance could be considered permanent, with each nation constantly reevaluating its position based on the evolving threats and opportunities presented by the changing balance of power. The role of Spain, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. In the wake of Napoleon's return to power, Spain, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire would have had distinct roles to play in the shifting European order. While not as centrally involved in the power struggles between the major European powers, these states would have been influenced by the outcomes of Napoleon's second reign, with their own strategic interests shaping their responses to his resurgence. Spain, once a key ally of Napoleon during his earlier conquests, would have found itself in a precarious position. After being largely subjugated by French rule during the Peninsular War, Spain had experienced significant social, political, and economic turmoil. A return of Napoleon to the throne would have revived old tensions between Spain and France, as the Spanish people and their monarchy would likely have resisted any attempt to reassert French dominance. The Spanish government, backed by the people's desire for independence, would have sought support from Britain and other European powers to prevent French interference in Iberian affairs. Spain's role would likely have been one of resistance, aiding in efforts to curtail Napoleon's ambitions while simultaneously trying to rebuild its own fractured political system and regain its former influence in Europe. Italy, divided into multiple states and under various levels of French control during Napoleon's first reign, would have also had a complicated relationship with the renewed French Empire. The Kingdom of Italy, which Napoleon had established in northern Italy, would have likely remained a French satellite. However, the rest of Italy, including the Papal States, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, would have had conflicting interests. Some Italian states might have been inclined to ally with France in exchange for territorial gains or protection from other European powers, while others, particularly the Papal States, would have been hostile to a second Napoleonic empire. Italy's role in the conflict would have been shaped by its divisions and the complex web of local and foreign influences, with its various regions caught between French dominance and the desire for independence. The Ottoman Empire, situated on the periphery of the main European conflicts, would have had its own concerns during this period. Already struggling with internal instability and external threats from Russia and Austria, the Ottoman Empire would have been wary of any shifts in the European balance of power that might affect its interests. Although not directly involved in the Napoleonic Wars, the Ottomans would have watched with interest as Napoleon's empire expanded and contracted. The Ottomans had historical animosities with Russia, and any strengthening of Russian influence in Eastern Europe or the Balkans could have prompted the Ottomans to intervene or realign their foreign policies. The Ottoman Empire's role would likely have been more passive, but still significant, as it navigated the changing alliances and threats posed by both Napoleon and the European powers. Spain, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, while not central to the European power struggles, would have played key supporting roles in the complex web of alliances and conflicts that followed Napoleon's return. Their actions and policies would have influenced the outcomes of the broader power dynamics, as each sought to protect its own interests while dealing with the repercussions of a revived French Empire. Chapter 8: The Napoleonic Wars Reignite. With Napoleon's return to power, the fragile peace that had settled over Europe after his first abdication would have been shattered, raising the prospect of another round of devastating warfare. The possibility of the Napoleonic Wars reigniting was not merely theoretical. The political and military situation in Europe had evolved in ways that made it highly likely that the major powers would once again be drawn into conflict. Napoleon's second reign posed a direct challenge to the existing European order, which had been carefully constructed by the Congress of Vienna and was underpinned by the desire to prevent the rise of any hegemonic power. The first indication that the Napoleonic Wars could reignite would have been the reactions of Europe's great powers to Napoleon's resurgence. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, all of whom had been involved in the wars against Napoleon, would have immediately viewed his return with deep suspicion and alarm. Their primary concern would have been that a reinvigorated France under Napoleon's leadership would once again attempt to dominate Europe through military conquest. In response, these nations would likely have begun to mobilize their forces and reinforce their alliances, preparing for another conflict to preserve the balance of power. The key question facing these powers would have been how to effectively contain Napoleon's ambitions. Would they pursue a military strategy to expel France from its newly acquired territories and restore the status quo? Or would they attempt to reach a diplomatic resolution with France, fearing the devastation of another prolonged war? The experience of the previous wars had shown that defeating Napoleon on the battlefield required immense resources and cooperation. But the memory of the horrors of war and the desire for stability might have led some powers to consider negotiation rather than outright confrontation. Napoleon, for his part, would have been determined to rebuild his empire, and his military prowess and charisma would have made him a formidable opponent. Having rebuilt his army, he would likely have sought to assert his dominance through both military victories and strategic alliances, hoping to split Europe's great powers and prevent them from uniting against him. His plans would have involved swift and decisive campaigns aimed at re-establishing French influence across Europe, possibly targeting areas that had been lost during his first downfall. The reignition of the Napoleonic Wars would have been shaped not only by military campaigns, but also by the broader political and diplomatic dynamics of the time. The interplay between war, diplomacy, and shifting alliances would have determined whether the continent was plunged back into conflict or whether a new peace could be achieved. Despite the desire for stability, the rise of Napoleon, once again, would have left Europe with little choice but to confront the reality of war. The question of whether the Napoleonic Wars would reignite depended on the willingness of the powers to resist or accommodate Napoleon's ambitions, leading to a volatile and uncertain future. Would Napoleon push further? After reclaiming the French throne and reinstating the Napoleonic Empire, one of the most pressing questions would have been whether Napoleon, emboldened by his return, would push further into Europe in an attempt to expand his empire or secure even greater dominance. The trajectory of his second reign was deeply influenced by his previous experience in building a vast empire through military conquest. With a deeply entrenched desire for glory and an almost unparalleled military genius, Napoleon was not likely to settle for merely defending France. He would have aimed to expand French influence and potentially to reassert his authority over the territories that he had lost after his initial downfall. The first logical target for Napoleon's ambitions would have been Europe's peripheral regions. He had historically sought to secure control of key strategic territories, and with Europe's great powers preoccupied with their own post-Waterloo recovery, Napoleon could have seen an opportunity to strike. In particular, Napoleon might have turned his attention to the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain had been severely weakened by years of war. The Spanish territories, although nominally independent, were still ripe for manipulation or direct French control. The capture of Spain would have provided Napoleon with vital strategic and economic advantages, not only extending his empire's borders, but also securing critical Mediterranean and Atlantic access. Another possible focus for Napoleon's expansion would have been Italy. The Kingdom of Italy, created during Napoleon's first reign, had already been under his control, but several Italian states remained outside of his grasp. These regions, such as the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples, might have been easy targets for a resurgent French empire. By securing full control over the Italian peninsula, Napoleon would have cemented his influence in southern Europe and provided a powerful base from which to exert further control over European affairs. Napoleon's ultimate goal, however, was not simply to expand his empire's borders. He sought to reshape Europe into a system that centered on French dominance. His continued push would have been driven by the same imperial vision that characterized his previous campaigns, the creation of a French-led order in which European countries were either directly controlled by France or aligned with it through strategic alliances. This would have entailed the subjugation of key powers like Britain, Russia, and Prussia, with whom Napoleon had long-standing rivalries. The question of whether Napoleon would push further also depended on how Europe's great powers responded to his resurgence. If they were slow to organize a coordinated resistance, Napoleon might have taken advantage of any perceived weaknesses in his enemies. However, if the major powers rapidly consolidated and began to challenge his authority, it could have deterred Napoleon from pushing too far and instead focusing on consolidating his position within France and its immediate borders. His military audacity, combined with the unpredictable dynamics of European politics, made the possibility of further aggression a very real concern for the continent. Possible wars against Russia and Austria. As Napoleon reestablished his rule in France, one of the most pressing questions was how he would deal with the major powers that had opposed him during his first reign, Russia and Austria. Both countries had long been key adversaries of Napoleon, and their involvement in the coalition that defeated him at Waterloo made them natural contenders for future conflict. With the French Empire's resurgence, the potential for renewed hostilities with Russia and Austria was highly likely, especially considering the strategic ambitions that Napoleon harbored for both Eastern and Central Europe. The first likely point of contention between France and Austria would have been the balance of power in Central Europe. Austria had been a central player in the coalition against Napoleon and had suffered considerable losses during the Napoleonic Wars. With Napoleon's return, Austria would have been particularly concerned about the prospect of losing further influence in the region. Napoleon, in turn, would have sought to restore French dominance over Italy and the surrounding areas, which would have inevitably brought him into conflict with Austria, whose interests in northern Italy were significant. The question of control over the Italian peninsula was likely to reignite tensions, as Austria had historically viewed Italy as part of its sphere of influence. Napoleon's ambitions also extended into the broader European order, and Austria, as a significant land power in Europe, would have been in direct opposition to his attempts to reshape the continent according to French interests. The creation of buffer states, strategic alliances, and territorial gains at Austria's expense would have been key components of Napoleon's plans. A military confrontation between the two powers seemed almost inevitable, as the French emperor aimed to reassert his authority in regions that Austria considered vital to its own security and influence. In the case of Russia, Napoleon's past experience with Tsar Alexander I had been fraught with animosity and distrust. The Russian Empire, a rising power in Europe, was unlikely to accept Napoleon's reassertion of French control without a significant response. Napoleon had already shown a willingness to invade Russia in 1812, and while the disastrous campaign led to his first downfall, the geopolitical dynamics had changed. Russia had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as a key player, but a revived French Empire posed a threat to its ambitions in Eastern Europe and beyond. Napoleon would likely have viewed Russia as a major obstacle to his control of Europe, and a war against Russia seemed almost inevitable as Napoleon sought to expand his influence into the Eastern territories. Both Russia and Austria would have had reasons to mobilize against France, either to preserve their own territorial integrity or to counter the rising tide of French imperialism. The question of when and how Napoleon would engage them depended on how quickly he could consolidate his power internally and rebuild his military strength. Regardless of the timing, wars against both Russia and Austria seemed like a natural consequence of Napoleon's continued push for dominance in Europe. The shifting alliances and ever-present rivalries in the region made further conflict between these powers almost unavoidable. Could France dominate Europe indefinitely? The question of whether France could dominate Europe indefinitely under Napoleon's rule is one that hinges on multiple factors, including military prowess, political stability, the responses of neighboring powers, and the changing dynamics of international alliances. While Napoleon's military genius and previous successes had allowed France to build a vast empire, the challenge of maintaining that dominance over an extended period would have been substantial. Napoleon's reign was built on rapid military victories and the ability to consolidate power quickly. His military tactics, combined with the discipline and innovation of the French army, made France a dominant force across Europe. However, the nature of Napoleon's empire was such that it required constant warfare and the management of vast territories, many of which had populations and leaders resistant to French rule. The long-term stability of France's dominance would have been challenged by the need to continuously secure and maintain control over these regions. For France to dominate Europe indefinitely, Napoleon would have needed to ensure the loyalty of the territories he controlled. He had already faced significant resistance from various regions, such as Spain and parts of Germany, during his first reign. Managing such vast territorial holdings, with diverse political landscapes and national identities, would have required Napoleon to navigate complex diplomatic and military challenges. The question was not just whether France could win battles, but whether it could keep its empire intact in the face of sustained resistance. Moreover, the willingness of other European powers to accept French dominance would have played a critical role. While Napoleon had successfully built alliances in the past, the other great powers of Europe, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, would have remained deeply wary of France's growing power. The idea of a hegemonic French empire was anathema to the balance of power that these countries sought to preserve. As long as the coalition powers were able to unite in opposition to Napoleon, France's dominance could have been threatened. The role of Britain was particularly significant. As a maritime power, Britain could counter French dominance by challenging its naval power and supporting insurgencies in France-controlled territories. Napoleon's inability to conquer Britain during his first reign had already shown the limits of his power. And even with a second resurgence, France's inability to fully neutralize Britain would have left a significant obstacle to indefinite dominance. Ultimately, while France under Napoleon had the potential to exert significant influence over Europe, the idea of indefinite domination was far from certain. France's success would have been dependent on maintaining military supremacy, preventing rebellions, and managing the complicated web of European alliances and rivalries. Given the historical resistance of other powers and the logistical challenges of ruling such a vast empire, it seems unlikely that France could have maintained dominance indefinitely without significant and sustained challenges from its neighbors. Chapter 9: The Americas and Beyond. The implications of a renewed Napoleonic empire stretched far beyond the borders of Europe, reaching into the Americas and other distant territories. As France regained its power on the European continent, Napoleon would have sought to expand his influence globally, both to secure resources and to challenge the growing power of other colonial empires, particularly Britain and Spain. The Americas, with their wealth of natural resources and growing political instability, would have become a key theater for French ambitions, while Napoleon might have also looked toward Asia and Africa as additional areas for expansion. The Americas, particularly Latin America, were in a state of flux during the early 19th century. Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires were in decline, with growing independence movements across the continent. This presented an opportunity for Napoleon to increase French influence by either supporting the independence movements or directly claiming territories for France. French involvement in the Americas could have played a significant role in reshaping the future of the continent. For example, Napoleon might have sought to establish a French presence in Spanish-controlled areas, such as Mexico and the Caribbean, by supporting local independence movements or intervening militarily. His previous attempt to control the island of Hispaniola, which led to the loss of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, demonstrated both the opportunities and risks involved in such ventures. Napoleon's ambitions in the Americas could have also been focused on reclaiming territories that had once belonged to France. The Louisiana Territory, sold to the United States in 1803, could have been a key target for France's expansionist policies. With France's renewed military strength, Napoleon might have attempted to reassert control over Louisiana, potentially leading to a conflict with the United States. The prospect of regaining French territories in the Americas would have had significant consequences for the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, particularly as the United States was emerging as a new, growing power. In addition to the Americas, Napoleon's empire might have sought to expand into Asia and Africa. The French had long been involved in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, but the post-Waterloo resurgence of France could have allowed Napoleon to push further into these regions. France might have sought to establish or expand colonies in India, the Malay Peninsula, or even into China's more peripheral territories. Such efforts would have directly challenged British colonial interests in these regions, particularly in India, where Britain had already established a dominant presence. Napoleon's empire had long been seen as a formidable force with ambitions beyond Europe. With the revitalization of France's military might, the Americas and other global territories would have become key arenas for French expansion. However, such ventures would have been fraught with challenges, particularly in the face of British naval power and the growing resistance to European colonialism across the world. Despite the potential for global expansion, the question of how long France could sustain such endeavors would have ultimately depended on the ability to balance European dominance with overseas ambitions. Impact on the United States and Latin America. A revived Napoleonic Empire in Europe would have had profound effects on both the United States and Latin America, regions that were increasingly asserting their independence and autonomy during the early 19th century. The United States, a young and growing power, and the various independence movements throughout Latin America were shaping the political landscape of the Western Hemisphere, and Napoleon's resurgence would have introduced new complexities into their paths toward development. For the United States, a renewed French presence in the Americas would have presented both opportunities and significant challenges. The most immediate issue would have been the fate of the Louisiana Territory, which France had ceded to the United States in 1803. With Napoleon's return to power, there was a distinct possibility that he would seek to regain control of this vast and strategically important land, potentially leading to tensions or even conflict with the U.S. While the United States had grown significantly since 1803, it was still relatively young and lacked the military power to fully defend its territorial acquisitions. If Napoleon had attempted to retake Louisiana, it could have led to a conflict with the United States, which would have altered the course of American expansion westward. Additionally, Napoleon's presence in the Americas could have complicated U.S. foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine, established in 1823, was a key U.S. policy aimed at deterring European interference in the Western Hemisphere. A resurgent Napoleonic empire could have led to an escalation of tensions, especially if Napoleon sought to intervene in the independence movements that were beginning to sweep across Latin America. The United States had already expressed interest in supporting independence movements, and with France potentially taking an active role in Latin American affairs, the stage could have been set for a diplomatic and possibly military showdown between the U.S. and France. For Latin America, Napoleon's resurgence could have had mixed effects. The various independence movements in Spanish and Portuguese colonies, which were gaining momentum during the early 19th century, might have been either supported or undermined by France. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, might have seen the instability in Spanish America as a chance to extend French influence or even establish French-controlled puppet states. However, Napoleon's involvement in these movements could have led to complications. While France had historically been a supporter of Republican ideals, Napoleon's imperial ambitions meant that he was unlikely to back a truly independent Latin America. His potential involvement could have resulted in puppet regimes under French control, leading to a different form of European colonialism rather than the independent republics that many Latin American nations sought. Moreover, Napoleon's ambitions in Latin America would have drawn the attention of Britain, which had its own colonial interests in the Americas. Britain, a major maritime power, would have likely sought to contain French expansion in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, where British colonies, such as Jamaica and Trinidad, were situated. This could have led to a resurgence of Anglo-French rivalries in the Americas, further complicating the region's political landscape. In sum, a revitalized Napoleonic empire would have dramatically impacted both the United States and Latin America, shaping the course of political and territorial development in the Western Hemisphere. The tensions between French ambitions, U.S. interests, and the independence movements of Latin America would have created a volatile and dynamic situation that could have altered the trajectory of the entire continent. The fate of European colonies. A renewed Napoleonic empire would have had far-reaching consequences for European colonial holdings across the globe. With Napoleon's military genius and strategic vision, his ambitions were not confined to Europe alone. As he solidified his power in Europe, his influence would likely have extended to European colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, challenging the traditional power structures of colonial empires, particularly those of Britain, Spain, and Portugal. The fate of these colonies would have depended on the balance between French expansionism and the response of other colonial powers. In the Americas, Napoleon's presence could have reshaped the colonial landscape. French expansion, particularly in the Caribbean and parts of South America, could have sparked new conflicts with Spain, Britain, and Portugal. French colonies, like Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, were critical to France's economy, and Napoleon's ambition to restore French influence in the Americas might have led to attempts to reclaim lost territories or assert control over regions that were rebelling against colonial powers. For instance, Napoleon could have capitalized on the political instability in Spanish America, either supporting independence movements or directly intervening to establish French influence in the region, potentially fostering new conflicts with other European colonial powers who sought to maintain control over their territories. In Africa, Napoleon's renewed empire might have posed a challenge to the Portuguese and British colonial holdings along the coasts. The French had long been active in North Africa, and Napoleon's ambitions could have extended into sub-Saharan Africa as well. French influence might have spread along the west coast or into Central Africa, where French economic interests, such as the slave trade and resource extraction, could have competed with those of Britain and Portugal. The French presence could have destabilized the existing colonial order, further complicating the struggle for African territories between the European powers. Asia, particularly India and Southeast Asia, would have seen significant shifts in the balance of power. Napoleon's rivalry with Britain could have extended to the British colonies in India, where the British East India Company had grown in power. France might have sought to establish a greater presence in India or Southeast Asia, potentially using military force to challenge British dominance in the region. Napoleon had already shown interest in the East, and his return to power could have ignited a new phase of colonial competition, with France attempting to establish or expand its influence at Britain's expense. The fate of European colonies would have been dramatically altered in a world where Napoleon had triumphed. The traditional colonial powers of Spain, Britain, and Portugal would have had to reassess their strategies for maintaining their overseas empires. French expansionism, combined with local resistance to colonial rule, would have likely led to an even more volatile and competitive colonial era, reshaping the global order. Would France reclaim lost territories? One of the central questions in a world where Napoleon's empire had been resurrected is whether France would seek to reclaim the territories it had lost in the previous wars. Under Napoleon's leadership, France had seen its borders expand dramatically across Europe and beyond, but following his defeat, much of this territory was ceded to rival powers at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The loss of territories such as the Kingdom of Italy, the Low Countries, and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire left France feeling diminished, both militarily and politically. With Napoleon back in power, it is likely that reclaiming these lost territories would have been a key objective for him, particularly to reassert French dominance in Europe. In Europe, one of the first areas Napoleon would have focused on reclaiming would likely have been the Austrian Netherlands, present-day Belgium. This region had been under French control during the Revolutionary Wars, but after Napoleon's defeat, it was handed over to the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Napoleon's desire for a secure western frontier and his ambitions for expanding French influence would have made Belgium a prime target. Given its strategic importance and economic potential, reclaiming Belgium would have likely been one of Napoleon's primary goals in his return to power. In a world where France won at Waterloo, Napoleon may have launched military campaigns to either annex the region directly or establish a French-controlled puppet state. Napoleon may have also looked to the Italian peninsula, where France had once exerted considerable influence. Italy had been fragmented into a number of states, some of which were under French control, such as the Kingdom of Naples and the Cisalpine Republic. After Napoleon's downfall, these territories were largely returned to Austrian and other foreign control. A return to power would have given Napoleon an opportunity to either reclaim these territories outright or to manipulate local political forces to bring them back under French influence. In particular, Napoleon had long seen Italy as a key part of France's geopolitical strategy, and its economic and strategic value could not have been ignored in a second iteration of his empire. Beyond Europe, Napoleon may have also sought to reassert French control over territories lost in the Americas, most notably the Louisiana Territory. Although the United States had already purchased the region, a stronger French empire could have sought to reoccupy or even reclaim Louisiana, potentially sparking conflict with the United States. Overall, a restored Napoleonic empire would have seen France not only attempting to reassert its military and political dominance within Europe, but also reclaiming the territories that had once formed the backbone of its empire. While Napoleon's ambitions would have been tempered by the strength of other European powers, the desire to recover these lost territories would have been a central element of his grand strategy. Chapter 10: The Long-Term Vision of Napoleon. Napoleon's ambitions were not just confined to his immediate military conquests or his short-term political goals. He had a grand vision for Europe and the world that extended far beyond his reign. His long-term vision revolved around reshaping the continent into a French-dominated empire that would secure his legacy for generations to come. A revitalized Napoleonic empire would not only seek to reclaim lost territories, but also to create a new order, one where France would be at the center of a vast European federation, with all of Europe working under the guiding hand of French leadership. Central to Napoleon's long-term vision was the idea of consolidating a unified Europe under French hegemony. He had already made significant strides in this direction during his previous rule, where he reorganized large swaths of Europe into French-controlled client states or outright annexed territories. A second Napoleonic empire would have focused on deepening and expanding this network of satellite states, all working in unison under a single French banner. This vision would have meant the creation of a vast economic and political bloc that could rival or even surpass the power of Britain, the United States, and Russia in the 19th century. Napoleon had often spoken of the need for a unified Europe to ensure peace and stability on the continent, though it would be a peace under the absolute control of French imperialism. Napoleon also envisioned a Europe where the French Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were spread, albeit under his own brand of authoritarian rule. While Napoleon's regime was authoritarian and imperial, he saw himself as a progressive force, modernizing Europe's economies, legal systems, and social structures. His Code Napoleon had already been influential across Europe, and in a world where he was victorious at Waterloo, he would likely have sought to impose these legal reforms even more broadly, pushing for a Europe that was more interconnected and modernized than it had ever been before. In addition to a united Europe, Napoleon's ambitions extended to his military vision. He would have sought to build a new, powerful French military that could maintain the empire's dominance and deter any potential rivals. This military would not have been solely focused on conquest. It would have been used to police the empire and prevent uprisings or rebellion. Napoleon had a keen interest in the science of war and military strategy, and he likely would have continued to modernize his army, integrating technological advancements and improving logistical systems to ensure that France maintained its superiority on the battlefield. Ultimately, Napoleon's long-term vision was one of sustained French dominance, a Europe restructured with France at its core, guiding its future with the emperor's personal brand of ambition and authority. Whether this vision could have endured beyond Napoleon's own lifetime is uncertain, but it was a vision that would have shaped European politics for decades, if not centuries, to come. His ambitions for France and Europe. Napoleon's vision for France and Europe extended far beyond military conquest, It encompassed a profound transformation of the continent, one where France stood at the center of a unified, powerful empire. At the core of his ambitions was the idea of creating a French-dominated Europe that would reshape the balance of power on the continent and secure France's place as the undisputed leader of Europe for generations. His ambition was not merely to expand France's borders, but to impose a new political and social order that would extend the ideals of the French Revolution across the continent, though in a form that was controlled by his autocratic rule. For France, Napoleon sought to establish a stable and prosperous nation, free from the internal turmoil that had plagued it before his rise to power. He envisioned an empire that was both economically powerful and militarily formidable, able to withstand any external threats while also controlling its destiny. A key element of his vision was to modernize France's institutions, including legal systems, economic policies, and infrastructure. His introduction of the Napoleonic Code, which reformed the legal system, served as the foundation for much of his vision of a modern state. Through these reforms, he sought to create a society based on merit rather than birthright, ensuring that the brightest minds could rise to the top of French society, regardless of their social background. On a larger scale, Napoleon's ambitions for Europe involved the creation of a vast, interconnected network of states, each loyal to France and its leadership. This vision included both direct annexations of territories and the creation of satellite states that would be bound by political, military, and economic ties to France. He believed that by creating this system of satellite states, France could dominate Europe, making it the focal point of both political and economic power. Napoleon's vision was one of order and stability, but one in which France's dominance was undisputed. He envisioned a Europe where France was not merely a power among others, but the central hub, guiding the continent's future and maintaining its peace through French strength and leadership. In addition to political and military control, Napoleon also aimed to spread the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, across Europe. However, he sought to do this under the authority of his own leadership, offering a more structured, centralized form of governance. Though his regime was authoritarian, Napoleon believed he was the only leader capable of preserving these revolutionary ideals while simultaneously maintaining order and stability across a continent that had seen decades of warfare and upheaval. The Napoleonic Code and Governance. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies was the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that reformed the legal system in France and had far-reaching effects across Europe. The code was not just a legal document. It was a cornerstone of Napoleon's vision for a modern, centralized state and a vital part of his governance model. In the chaos following the French Revolution, Napoleon recognized the need for a cohesive legal framework that could ensure stability, protect property rights, and create a uniform set of laws for all citizens. The Napoleonic Code achieved these goals while also embodying his ideals of merit and equality. The code itself was revolutionary in many ways. It abolished the feudal system that had long existed in France, replacing it with laws that granted equal rights to men and emphasized the importance of private property. This was in stark contrast to the previous legal systems, which were often unequal and arbitrary. The Napoleonic Code established clear rules regarding marriage, family, and inheritance, providing citizens with legal certainty and creating a more predictable social order. It also emphasized individual rights, including freedom of religion and the protection of property. For Napoleon, the Napoleonic Code was a means of consolidating his power and solidifying his rule. By instituting a single legal system across his empire, he eliminated regional differences in law and ensured that all of his subjects were governed by the same rules under his control. This was a key part of his broader goal of centralizing power in France and maintaining absolute control over its vast empire. The code helped Napoleon maintain order and prevent uprisings by offering a legal framework that was perceived as just, rational, and efficient. It also fostered loyalty among the people, as they saw themselves as equal under the law, regardless of their background or social status. Beyond France, the Napoleonic Code had a profound impact on the rest of Europe. As Napoleon expanded his empire, he spread the code to the territories he controlled, including parts of Italy, Spain, and Germany. The legal principles contained in the code influenced legal reforms in many European countries and even beyond Europe, as former colonies in the Americas and elsewhere adopted similar laws. The Napoleonic Code's emphasis on equality before the law, private property rights, and civil liberties became the foundation for modern legal systems in many parts of the world. Ultimately, the Napoleonic Code was not just a legal document. It was a critical instrument of governance that helped Napoleon reshape France and Europe, leaving a lasting impact on the legal and political landscape. Could he establish a lasting dynasty? One of Napoleon's most ambitious goals was to establish a lasting dynasty that would secure his family's rule over France and extend his empire's influence for generations. By the time of his victory at Waterloo and the creation of the Second Napoleonic Empire, he had laid the groundwork for what he hoped would be a long-lasting monarchy. Napoleon's personal drive, military genius, and vision for a restructured Europe made him a formidable ruler, but whether he could establish a dynasty that would endure beyond his reign remained uncertain. Napoleon's plans for a dynasty were rooted in his need for stability and continuity in his empire. His first step in ensuring the longevity of his power was to crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804, solidifying his authority and establishing the Napoleonic Empire as a hereditary monarchy. He then focused on securing the line of succession by marrying Marie-Louise of Austria and having a son, Napoleon II, whom he hoped would inherit the throne. This was a clear attempt to create a legitimate royal lineage, ensuring that power would pass smoothly to the next generation. Napoleon believed that his family could continue his vision for Europe, underlining his commitment to the dynasty. However, Napoleon's attempts to establish a lasting dynasty were fraught with challenges. For one, the empire was not universally accepted by all Europeans. While Napoleon had successfully restructured much of Europe under French control, many nations remained hostile to French domination and resented the imposition of French laws and the Napoleonic Code. This made it difficult for Napoleon to establish the kind of stability necessary for a dynasty to thrive. Furthermore, the Napoleonic system was deeply personal, relying on Napoleon's unique leadership and military genius. Without him, the empire faced internal divisions and external threats, which weakened the foundations of the dynasty. Napoleon's military adventures, which had brought France unparalleled power, also placed immense strain on his empire. Prolonged wars of expansion drained resources, weakened morale, and fostered resistance across Europe. With the eventual collapse of his empire, following the loss at Waterloo, Napoleon's dream of a lasting dynasty fell apart. His son, Napoleon II, was never able to assume power in France, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814, signaling the end of the Napoleonic era. While Napoleon's ambition for a dynasty was strong, the political and military challenges he faced, combined with the resistance to French hegemony, made it unlikely that his empire could have been sustained beyond his reign. Although his legacy and the Napoleonic Code would have a lasting impact, a lasting dynasty was not within his reach. Chapter 11: The Inevitable Downfall. Napoleon's empire, despite its early successes and his profound influence on European politics, was always precarious. The eventual downfall of the Napoleonic Empire, regardless of the hypothetical victory at Waterloo, seemed almost inevitable due to several key factors. These challenges ranged from internal instability and external opposition to the inherent flaws in his system of governance, all of which would have eventually undermined his long-term ambitions. First and foremost, the vast territorial expanse of the empire was unsustainable. Napoleon's vision of a Europe unified under French leadership was ambitious, but it created an empire stretched too thin. Holding on to such an extensive territory required immense resources and manpower, which were always in short supply. The logistical challenges of maintaining control over vast regions, particularly with constant warfare, made the Napoleonic system brittle. Even in a scenario where France had triumphed at Waterloo, the long-term strain of managing a sprawling empire would have posed severe challenges. Moreover, the opposition from other European powers would have remained formidable. Even if Britain, Prussia, and Austria had been forced into a peace settlement after a French victory at Waterloo, these nations were far from defeated. They had proven their resilience and would have bided their time to reclaim their influence. A fragile peace, especially one imposed through military might, would likely have been temporary. The same spirit of resistance that had fueled the wars against Napoleon before would continue to manifest, especially among those who resented French domination. Napoleon's internal political system also had inherent weaknesses. While the Napoleonic Code and his centralized control gave France a sense of stability, it relied heavily on Napoleon's personal leadership and vision. There was little room for political flexibility or adaptability. The imperial structure was not designed to survive a transition of power, as evidenced by the difficulties he faced in securing his dynasty. Any shift in leadership would likely have resulted in instability, either from within the French bureaucracy or from rebellious factions. Napoleon's over-reliance on military conquest also contributed to the eventual downfall. His military prowess was unmatched, but the prolonged wars, especially the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, had already begun to erode the strength of his forces. The loss of so many troops and resources weakened his ability to project power and sustain his empire. In conclusion, while a victory at Waterloo may have temporarily delayed the inevitable, the factors contributing to the downfall of Napoleon's empire were ingrained in the structure of the empire itself. Overextension, internal instability, and unrelenting external opposition made it increasingly likely that Napoleon's reign would not endure in the long run, regardless of his initial triumphs. His ambitions for France and Europe. Napoleon's vision for France and Europe extended far beyond military conquest. It encompassed a profound transformation of the continent, one where France stood at the center of a unified, powerful empire. At the core of his ambitions was the idea of creating a French-dominated Europe that would reshape the balance of power on the continent and secure France's place as the undisputed leader of Europe for generations. His ambition was not merely to expand France's borders, but to impose a new political and social order that would extend the ideals of the French Revolution across the continent, though in a form that was controlled by his autocratic rule. For France, Napoleon sought to establish a stable and prosperous nation, free from the internal turmoil that had plagued it before his rise to power. He envisioned an empire that was both economically powerful and militarily formidable, able to withstand any external threats while also controlling its destiny. A key element of his vision was to modernize France's institutions, including legal systems, economic policies, and infrastructure. His introduction of the Napoleonic Code, which reformed the legal system, served as the foundation for much of his vision of a modern state. Through these reforms, he sought to create a society based on merit rather than birthright, ensuring that the brightest minds could rise to the top of French society, regardless of their social background. On a larger scale, Napoleon's ambitions for Europe involved the creation of a vast, interconnected network of states, each loyal to France and its leadership. This vision included both direct annexations of territories and the creation of satellite states that would be bound by political, military, and economic ties to France. He believed that by creating this system of satellite states, France could dominate Europe, making it the focal point of both political and economic power. Napoleon's vision was one of order and stability, but one in which France's dominance was undisputed. He envisioned a Europe where France was not merely a power among others, but the central hub, guiding the continent's future and maintaining its peace through French strength and leadership. In addition to political and military control, Napoleon also aimed to spread the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, across Europe. However, he sought to do this under the authority of his own leadership, offering a more structured, centralized form of governance. Though his regime was authoritarian, Napoleon believed he was the only leader capable of preserving these revolutionary ideals while simultaneously maintaining order and stability across a continent that had seen decades of warfare and upheaval. The Napoleonic Code and Governance. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies was the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that reformed the legal system in France and had far-reaching effects across Europe. The code was not just a legal document. It was a cornerstone of Napoleon's vision for a modern, centralized state and a vital part of his governance model. In the chaos following the French Revolution, Napoleon recognized the need for a cohesive legal framework that could ensure stability, protect property rights, and create a uniform set of laws for all citizens. The Napoleonic Code achieved these goals while also embodying his ideals of merit and equality. The code itself was revolutionary in many ways. It abolished the feudal system that had long existed in France, replacing it with laws that granted equal rights to men and emphasized the importance of private property. This was in stark contrast to the previous legal systems, which were often unequal and arbitrary. The Napoleonic Code established clear rules regarding marriage, family, and inheritance, providing citizens with legal certainty and creating a more predictable social order. It also emphasized individual rights, including freedom of religion and the protection of property. For Napoleon, the Napoleonic Code was a means of consolidating his power and solidifying his rule. By instituting a single legal system across his empire, he eliminated regional differences in law and ensured that all of his subjects were governed by the same rules under his control. This was a key part of his broader goal of centralizing power in France and maintaining absolute control over its vast empire. The code helped Napoleon maintain order and prevent uprisings by offering a legal framework that was perceived as just, rational, and efficient. It also fostered loyalty among the people, as they saw themselves as equal under the law, regardless of their background or social status. Beyond France, the Napoleonic Code had a profound impact on the rest of Europe. As Napoleon expanded his empire, he spread the code to the territories he controlled, including parts of Italy, Spain, and Germany. The legal principles contained in the code influenced legal reforms in many European countries and even beyond Europe, as former colonies in the Americas and elsewhere adopted similar laws. The Napoleonic Code's emphasis on equality before the law, private property rights, and civil liberties became the foundation for modern legal systems in many parts of the world. Ultimately, the Napoleonic Code was not just a legal document. It was a critical instrument of governance that helped Napoleon reshape France and Europe, leaving a lasting impact on the legal and political landscape. Could he establish a lasting dynasty? One of Napoleon's most ambitious goals was to establish a lasting dynasty that would secure his family's rule over France and extend his empire's influence for generations. By the time of his victory at Waterloo and the creation of the Second Napoleonic Empire, he had laid the groundwork for what he hoped would be a long-lasting monarchy. Napoleon's personal drive, military genius, and vision for a restructured Europe made him a formidable ruler, but whether he could establish a dynasty that would endure beyond his reign remained uncertain. Napoleon's plans for a dynasty were rooted in his need for stability and continuity in his empire. His first step in ensuring the longevity of his power was to crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804, solidifying his authority and establishing the Napoleonic Empire as a hereditary monarchy. He then focused on securing the line of succession by marrying Marie-Louise of Austria and having a son, Napoleon II, whom he hoped would inherit the throne. This was a clear attempt to create a legitimate royal lineage, ensuring that power would pass smoothly to the next generation. Napoleon believed that his family could continue his vision for Europe, underlining his commitment to the dynasty. However, Napoleon's attempts to establish a lasting dynasty were fraught with challenges. For one, the empire was not universally accepted by all Europeans. While Napoleon had successfully restructured much of Europe under French control, many nations remained hostile to French domination and resented the imposition of French laws and the Napoleonic Code. This made it difficult for Napoleon to establish the kind of stability necessary for a dynasty to thrive. Furthermore, the Napoleonic system was deeply personal, relying on Napoleon's unique leadership and military genius. Without him, the empire faced internal divisions and external threats, which weakened the foundations of the dynasty. Napoleon's military adventures, which had brought France unparalleled power, also placed immense strain on his empire. Prolonged wars of expansion drained resources, weakened morale, and fostered resistance across Europe. With the eventual collapse of his empire, following the loss at Waterloo, Napoleon's dream of a lasting dynasty fell apart. His son, Napoleon II, was never able to assume power in France, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814, signaling the end of the Napoleonic era. While Napoleon's ambition for a dynasty was strong, the political and military challenges he faced, combined with the resistance to French hegemony, made it unlikely that his empire could have been sustained beyond his reign. Although his legacy and the Napoleonic Code would have a lasting impact, a lasting dynasty was not within his reach. Chapter 12: Legacy of an Alternate Napoleon. If Napoleon had emerged victorious at Waterloo and established a second Napoleonic empire, his legacy would have been vastly different from the one we recognize today. Instead of the image of a fallen emperor, remembered for his exile and the ultimate collapse of his empire, Napoleon's alternative legacy would have been one shaped by his vision of a restructured Europe under French domination. His impact on the continent, and perhaps even the world, would have left a profound imprint on history. Napoleon's greatest legacy was always his ability to reshape political and social systems. If his empire had endured, he would have solidified his reforms through the widespread implementation of the Napoleonic Code across Europe. These legal principles, emphasizing equality before the law and the abolition of feudal privileges, would have potentially spread to even more regions, shaping the legal frameworks of European nations for generations to come. His emphasis on meritocracy and the modernization of infrastructure, education, and the economy might have laid the foundation for an era of economic prosperity across Europe, led by France as the political center. However, his legacy would not have been solely one of progress and reform. The very nature of his empire, founded on military conquest, centralized authority, and authoritarian rule, would have meant that his legacy would have been controversial. The French Empire, which had long been the symbol of the Revolution's ideals, would have evolved into an imperial power whose actions were often dictated by the whims of one man. As Napoleon sought to expand and maintain his dominion, the violent suppression of uprisings and the ongoing war efforts would have been key components of his reign. The stability that might have come with an expanded empire would have been maintained through military might, and resistance from both within and outside the empire would have shaped the long-term outlook for his rule. Culturally, the Second Napoleonic Empire could have sparked a rethinking of European identity. Napoleon had a clear vision of a continent bound together through shared governance and political integration, with France at the center. While this might have fostered a sense of unity among certain factions, it would also have ignited tensions with those seeking national autonomy. Over time, the dominance of France and its imprint on European culture could have prompted a different path for art, literature, and philosophy, perhaps one that leaned more heavily into the ideas of the Enlightenment and revolutionary thought. In the broader global context, Napoleon's victory could have altered the trajectory of international relations, especially in the Americas and Asia. His vision of a strong, centralized Europe may have shifted the global balance of power, potentially influencing colonial policies and the emergence of new world powers. Ultimately, the legacy of an alternate Napoleon would have been a complex and multifaceted one. While he would have shaped a Europe that was more interconnected, modern, and perhaps more centralized under French influence, it would have been a world in which his ambitions, though impressive, would have been forever at odds with the revolutionary ideals he sought to uphold. France's role in a different 19th century. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo and established a second Napoleonic empire, France's role in the 19th century would have been vastly different from the historical reality. In this alternate version of history, France would have emerged as the central power in Europe, reshaping the continent's political and social landscape for decades to come. Under Napoleon's leadership, France would have continued to dominate European affairs, consolidating its control over vast territories through a network of client states and annexed regions. The Napoleonic Empire would likely have extended beyond its historical borders, absorbing more of the continent into its fold. In this new Europe, France would have been the political, economic, and cultural hub, with its influence reaching into neighboring regions and even beyond, potentially transforming the balance of power in global geopolitics. One of the most significant changes would have been France's ability to shape the future of European governance. Instead of the fragmented states of the early 19th century, the continent could have evolved into a more unified, centrally controlled bloc under French leadership. Napoleon's vision for a continent united under French ideals, particularly the concepts of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, would have been pushed further, albeit with a more authoritarian bent. The Napoleonic Code, already established in many regions, would likely have become the legal framework for much of Europe, fostering greater integration of legal systems across the continent. France's dominance would also have had a significant impact on colonial policies and global trade. With a stable and expansive empire, France would have been in a position to challenge Britain's maritime and colonial supremacy. Napoleon's focus on strengthening France's military might, combined with his ambitions for imperial expansion, might have led to a more aggressive French colonial strategy. This could have shifted the colonial balance of power, particularly in regions like the Americas and Asia, where France would have sought to assert its influence in place of Britain. Culturally, France would have remained a beacon of Enlightenment ideals, fostering intellectual movements that could have shaped European thought and governance for generations. The arts, sciences, and philosophy would likely have flourished under French patronage, cementing France's position as the cultural heart of Europe. In this alternate 19th century, France's role as a global power would have been undisputed, and its influence would have shaped the course of world history in ways that we can only speculate about. Whether this dominance would have lasted, and at what cost to the rest of Europe, remains a question for historians, but it is clear that France would have been the undisputed leader of the continent. France's role in a different 19th century. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo and established a second Napoleonic empire, France's role in the 19th century would have been vastly different from the historical reality. In this alternate version of history, France would have emerged as the central power in Europe, reshaping the continent's political and social landscape for decades to come. Under Napoleon's leadership, France would have continued to dominate European affairs, consolidating its control over vast territories through a network of client states and annexed regions. The Napoleonic Empire would likely have extended beyond its historical borders, absorbing more of the continent into its fold. In this new Europe, France would have been the political, economic, and cultural hub, with its influence reaching into neighboring regions and even beyond, potentially transforming the balance of power in global geopolitics. One of the most significant changes would have been France's ability to shape the future of European governance. Instead of the fragmented states of the early 19th century, the continent could have evolved into a more unified, centrally controlled bloc under French leadership. Napoleon's vision for a continent united under French ideals, particularly the concepts of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, would have been pushed further, albeit with a more authoritarian bent. The Napoleonic Code, already established in many regions, would likely have become the legal framework for much of Europe, fostering greater integration of legal systems across the continent. France's dominance would also have had a significant impact on colonial policies and global trade. With a stable and expansive empire, France would have been in a position to challenge Britain's maritime and colonial supremacy. Napoleon's focus on strengthening France's military might, combined with his ambitions for imperial expansion, might have led to a more aggressive French colonial strategy. This could have shifted the colonial balance of power, particularly in regions like the Americas and Asia, where France would have sought to assert its influence in place of Britain. Culturally, France would have remained a beacon of Enlightenment ideals, fostering intellectual movements that could have shaped European thought and governance for generations. The arts, sciences, and philosophy would likely have flourished under French patronage, cementing France's position as the cultural heart of Europe. In this alternate 19th century, France's role as a global power would have been undisputed, and its influence would have shaped the course of world history in ways that we can only speculate about. Whether this dominance would have lasted, and at what cost to the rest of Europe, remains a question for historians, but it is clear that France would have been the undisputed leader of the continent. The impact on World War I and beyond. If Napoleon had successfully established and maintained a second Napoleonic empire after the Battle of Waterloo, the course of European history would have been radically altered, potentially preventing or reshaping World War I and its aftermath. The long-term impact of a victorious Napoleon would reverberate through the decades, influencing both the structure of Europe and the geopolitics of the early 20th century. In this alternate scenario, the balance of power in Europe would have been dramatically different. Instead of a Europe marked by the fragile alliances and tensions that characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Napoleon's French Empire would have dominated much of the continent. A stable, centralized French hegemony could have staved off the nationalist movements that contributed to the outbreak of World War I. Without the constant pressure from rising powers like Germany, Italy, and Russia, the likelihood of a conflict between major European powers might have been significantly reduced. Furthermore, France's dominance in Europe would have meant that the growing tensions between European empires, particularly over colonial expansion, might have taken a different form. Napoleon's focus on maintaining a powerful, centralized French empire could have led to more stringent controls over colonial territories, possibly limiting the imperial rivalries that later contributed to global conflict. The competition for colonies between European powers, a key driver of World War I, might have been tempered under a French-dominated European order. Economically, a Napoleonic-dominated Europe could have seen a more unified trading bloc, potentially preventing the sharp economic divisions that led to the rise of militarism and protectionism in the early 20th century. A strong French-led European Union-like structure might have promoted peace through economic integration, reducing the likelihood of the kind of economic isolationism and arms races that characterized the pre-World War I period. On the global stage, Napoleon's empire might have pursued more assertive policies in the Americas and Asia, potentially clashing with Britain, but this could have led to different forms of conflict, such as smaller regional wars or naval engagements, rather than the world-altering conflict of World War I. With France at the helm of European affairs, the rise of the United States as a global power could have taken a different trajectory as well, with France possibly exerting more influence over American political and economic systems. In the long term, the continuation of the Napoleonic Empire would have created a vastly different geopolitical landscape. The colonial powers might have maintained their empires longer, the European political structure would have remained more centralized, and the tensions that led to the First World War might have been postponed or entirely avoided. Whether this would have led to a more peaceful or more volatile world remains speculative, but it's clear that the impact on global conflict would have been profound. The hypothetical scenario of a second Napoleonic Empire brings a fascinating exploration of what might have been had Napoleon's vision of European dominance come to fruition. From reshaping Europe into a vast French-controlled federation to possibly influencing the political and economic dynamics of the world, Napoleon's ambitions stretched far beyond the immediate goals of military conquest. His long-term vision of a restructured Europe, one under French hegemony, might have created a different trajectory for the continent's history, with the potential to prevent or delay the tensions that eventually led to World War I. Had Napoleon been successful in consolidating his power after Waterloo, the economic, political, and social fabric of Europe could have undergone a transformation, possibly preventing the rise of nationalistic movements that later fueled conflict. The Napoleonic Code, a lasting legacy of his reign, could have further modernized Europe, while his military reforms and consolidation of power might have ensured France's continued dominance in global affairs. The broader impact on global geopolitics would have been significant. Britain, facing a dominant French empire, might have had to reconsider its own role in global trade and empire building. The United States and Latin America, as well as the European colonies, would have likely seen shifts in their relationships with Europe under a France-led world order. These changes could have potentially altered the course of history in profound ways, shifting alliances, economic power, and international conflicts for generations. In the end, the legacy of an alternate Napoleon and his empire would have been a defining feature of European and world history. Whether his vision could have endured beyond his reign is uncertain, but the lasting effects of his ambition would have influenced the political landscape for years to come. Whether it would have led to a more peaceful or turbulent world remains speculative, but it is clear that Napoleon's dreams of a French-dominated Europe would have left an indelible mark on the trajectory of history.